I want you to try and imagine a really specific scenario for a second. So today is Sunday, August 9, 2026, and you're just a regular voter in a modern democracy.
Right.
You go to the polls, you cast your ballot, you elect a parliament, and then that parliament forms a government.
Like you do in any democratic.
Exactly. And you expect that the people you just, hired through your vote are the ones who are going to make the most critical, society-altering decisions.
Because that's the social contract, right?
Right. But now, imagine that the ultimate deciders, the people holding the final trump card over national security or economic policy or basic civil rights, they aren't the people who won that election.
Yeah, that's where things get complicated.
Yeah, instead, the ultimate power rests with a small group of unelected officials. I mean, think about how your society actually functions if the most consequential debates aren't settled in the loud, messy halls of a parliament, but rather in the quiet, absolute chambers of a Supreme Court. How do you balance the collective will of millions of voters with the definitive strike of a judicial gavel?
Well, it really forces you to completely re-examine the very definition of a democracy, honestly, because we are so conditioned to believe that power intrinsically flows from the ballot box up,
Totally.
So when you introduce a system where that flow is heavily filtered or redirected or even completely halted by a judicial bench, you are looking at a fundamentally different operational model of government.
Right.
And I'd argue the friction between those two models, the elected representatives versus the appointed guardians, it's arguably the most explosive political fault line in the world right now.
It really is. And that friction is the exact center of our deep dive today. We are unpacking a massive, deeply polarized debate that has essentially fractured a nation.
Yeah, to put it mildly.
To put it mildly, yeah. We're going to be working through a stack of sources centered entirely around a highly provocative YouTube documentary series from the Israeli channel C14.
Right.
The series is called The Jurists' Rebellion, and it takes a huge magnifying glass to the Israeli judicial. Now, before we get into the mechanics I really need to make our mission here incredibly clear.
Always important with this kind of material.
Absolutely. This deep dive is absolutely not about taking political sides or telling you, the listener, who the good guys and bad guys are.
Yeah, because the source material we are examining today is highly opinionated. It presents a very specific, aggressive critique from a right-wing perspective regarding Israel's Supreme Court and its broader legal establishment.
Right, but the documentary also includes the counter-arguments and direct defense judges themselves.
Exactly. So our goal is to impartially dissect the arguments, analyze the historical claims, and, explore the vivid legal viewpoints presented in this text.
Yeah, we just want you to understand the actual mechanics of this societal debate so you can make sense of it on your own terms. Because the documentary makes a truly staggering claim.
It really does.
It argues that the fundamental DNA of the Israeli government was completely altered, not by a military coup or, a violent popular uprising,
right,
but by a quiet, methodical, and brilliant legal revolution. Like a revolution executed without a single bullet fired or a single ballot cast.
Yeah.
And according to this source material, that entire revolution was largely designed and orchestrated by one single towering figure, a man named Aharon Barak.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Who is Aharon Barak, and how did one man allegedly rewire an entire nation's democratic...
Well, to even begin to understand the claims being made in the Jurists' Rebellion, you have to understand the sheer monumental scale of Aharon Barak's legacy in Israel.
Right.
The filmmakers, despite their intense criticism, they acknowledge this reality immediately. They describe Barak as arguably the most influential figure in shaping the modern state of Israel, perhaps second only to David Ben-Gurion.
The guy who actually founded the country in 1948.
Exactly. Yeah.
Being ranked second only to the founding father of a nation is wild.
Yeah, it's a massive statement.
It tells you everything you need to know about the gravity this man holds. He isn't just a judge. He's an institution unto himself.
Right. And the source presents this deeply complex, almost paradoxical dual image of the man. On the one hand, you have the establishment orthodox view of Barak.
Okay.
He's a child survivor of the Holocaust. He was actually smuggled out of the Kovno ghetto in a sack.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And in Israel, a background like that carries an almost immeasurable moral weight.
Oh, absolutely. I can't even imagine.
So from those origins, he rises to become an undisputed legal prodigy. He's an Israel Prize laureate, a law professor at Hebrew University by a very young age, and eventually the president of the Supreme Court.
Right.
For decades, he was viewed globally as the quintessential, quote-unquote, statesman-like jurist.
Like the ultimate grown-up in the room.
Exactly. He was seen as this intellectual giant who floated above the incredibly muddy, volatile fray of Israeli coalition politics, the guardian of the rule of law.
But the documentary paints a starkly different picture, right? Like an almost Machiavellian picture.
Yeah, they frame him not as the selfless guardian of a fragile system, but as the deliberate mastermind of a government. The source argues that beneath his quiet, dignified academic persona, he harbored this personal agenda that essentially hijacked the entire national apparatus.
Okay, so how do they argue he pulled that off?
Well, the filmmakers argue that his supreme confidence in his own intellectual and moral clarity allowed him to justify systematically stripping power away from the elected branches of government.
Right. The phrase they use in the documentary is that he anticipated the future, which, out of context, that sounds like high praise for a visionary leader.
Oh, totally.
But in the context of the film, it's an accusation. They're saying he was playing a decades-long game of chess against the political establishment, quietly moving pieces into place before anyone even realized they were playing.
And that visionary philosophy, it's absolutely central to his worldview, at least as detailed in the text. Barak fundamentally believed that the court had a higher duty than simply reading the law as written. He viewed himself and his court as the ultimate moral arbiters of the state, especially, and this is key, in a country without a formal written constitution to anchor it.
Ah, right. That's a huge point.
Yeah, and there is a deeply illuminating quote in the source material from Barak himself that captures this perfectly.
Quote.
He famously stated that he doesn't regret any rulings where he, and I'm quoting here, didn't let the IDF win.
The IDF, obviously being the Israel Defense Forces.
Right, and he said this because he believed his ultimate allegiance was to the rule of law and human rights, even when it conflicted with the immediate desires of the military.
That quote is fascinating because in a country with Israel's unique and constant security situation, the military is a massive, revered establishment.
No, heavily revered.
So to openly say you're proud of the times you didn't let the generals win, that shows an incredible assertion of judicial supremacy. But hold on. If we are looking at this objectively, isn't it the mark of a strong, healthy democracy that the military doesn't always win in court?
That's a very fair point.
If the military wins every single time they go before a judge, you don't really have a democracy. You have a military dictatorship with a fancy courthouse attached to it to make it look legitimate, right?
Yeah.
It sounds like he's just doing his job, protecting civil rights against state power.
And Barak's defenders would completely endorse your perspective. They argue that the rule of law must be even to national heroes. And
right.
The concept is that the court must serve as a bulwark against state overreach. However, the documentary's counter-argument is that Barak didn't merely constrain the military or the government.
Okay, what did he do then?
He elevated the judiciary to a point where the judges became the sole unaccountable dictators of what is militarily or...
Oh, I see.
The critique is that he didn't just balance the power, he hoarded.
It makes me think of a master coder in the tech world who builds an operating system for a massive corporation, right?
Okay, I like this.
Yeah, so half the employees look at this programmer and think he brilliantly patched all the system's vulnerability. He created firewalls that protect the company from crashing.
Right, the guardian.
Exactly. But then the other half look at the exact same source code and realize he just hard-coded himself as the ultimate super admin.
Wow, yeah.
And now the CEO, the board of directors, the shareholders, none of them can even log in or change a single feature without his personal approval.
What's fascinating here is that analogy strikes at the very heart of the documentary because, as the source points out, this super admin status wasn't...
Right, no military coup.
Right. There were no tanks rolling down the streets of Jerusalem. It was achieved through a series of highly complex, methodical, and initially obscure legal...
Okay.
The documentary argues that to understand how Barak executed this quiet revolution, you have to look at the very first bound man, the foundational legal concept of what can actually be judged in a court of law, the concept of justiciability.
Okay, this is where the legal mechanics get really interesting. Because before the late 1970s, the source notes that the Israeli Supreme Court operated with a great deal of self-restraint.
Yes, very much so.
They followed a more traditional British or American model regarding, political questions.
Right.
If an issue brought before them was inherently political, like foreign policy decisions, military deployments, or purely political appointments.
Right, the stuff of politicians.
Exactly. Or even if there just wasn't a specific written law governing the issue, the court would essentially say, this is not our department. We don't have the tools to judge this. Take it to the parliament, let the voters.
And that doctrine of restraint was the standard operating for decades. The court recognized that some questions are solved by elections, not lawsuits.
Right.
But then Aharon Barak introduces a completely revolutionary doctrine. He systematically erodes this boundary and declares that, quote, Everything is justiciable.
Meaning
every single human action, every government policy, every diplomatic move is subject to trial and court review. He famously claimed that in the law, there are no black holes.
No black holes. So he is arguing that there is no space in human existence or government operation where the law doesn't apply.
Correct.
And therefore, there is no space where a judge cannot intervene.
Precisely. His philosophical argument was that even if there isn't a specific law regulating an action, the general principles of law, like justice, fairness, and equality, they always apply.
Right.
But the documentary is incredibly critical. They argue that if there is no specific concrete law passed by the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, and Barak says the court can still rule anyway, then what exactly is the court ruling on?
That's a good question.
The critics in the documentary call this a judge's halakha.
Halakha. Okay, so halakha is the term for Jewish religious law.
Yes.
By using that specific term, the filmmakers are implying that Barak turned his own personal, subjective legal philosophy into a kind of strict religious doctrine for the state.
Exactly.
If there's no written law prohibiting something, but the judge feels in his gut that it's wrong, he just invents the legal reasoning on the spot to stop it.
And the documentary mocks this process mercilessly. They refer to this mechanism as a laundromat of words.
Yes. I found that imagery in the text so striking. They make a joke about how someone should invent a brand of laundry detergent named after Aharon Barak.
Yes, specifically formulated for washing words.
Right. So the idea is that he takes the desired political outcome, like an outcome he personally wants to see happen, throws it into this judicial laundromat filled with complex, high-minded legal jargon, and it comes out the other side looking like a pristine, objective, unavoidable legal ruling.
It is a profound critique of judicial activism, and the source also points to a very specific phrase Barak used to describe his philosophy, melo kol ha'aretz mish, which roughly translates to the whole earth full of...
And as the source points out, that is a direct play on a very famous, culturally resonant Jewish religious phrase from the book of Isaiah, right?
Yes.
Melo kol ha'aretz kevodo, which means the whole earth is full of God's glory.
Right. So the filmmakers argue that Barak co-opted this deeply spiritual phrase to push a radical political agenda.
Okay.
If the whole earth is full of law, and the judge is the sole ultimate interpreter of the law, then by logical extension, the judge rules the whole earth.
Wow.
There is no realm, not the military, not economics, not foreign affairs, that is free from the judge's oversight.
When you really extrapolate that, it fundamentally changes the baseline of what a democracy is. Like in the democratic models you and I typically think of, the parliament sets the societal norms by writing law, and the court simply enforces those norms.
Right.
The parliament is the engine. The court is the mechanic fixing the engine when it breaks.
I like that.
But here, the source argues, the judge becomes the supreme ruler because they decide the norms themselves, even in the total absence of a law.
Right.
If the court steps in to make a ruling based on their own internal logic of what is fair, they haven't just interpreted a law, they have legislated.
And that is exactly where the documentary argues the power was effectively stolen, because if a member of parliament creates a norm you hate, you can vote them out in the next election.
Right. You canvass, you protest, you vote.
Exactly. You can organize, campaign, and change the legislature, but you cannot vote out a Supreme Court justice.
No.
Once they set a norm through this judge's halakha, the public is stuck with it, regardless of the popular will.
But here is the catch. Having the theoretical power to judge everything in the world means absolutely nothing if no one actually brings those cases into your courtroom. Right.
Right. The court is reactive.
Yeah, a judge can't just look out the window of the Supreme Court, see a new highway being built, and yell, "I object to that infrastructure project. Stop construction."
That would be hilarious, but no.
The system requires someone to file a lawsuit. A case has to be brought to the bench.
Exactly.
And that leads us to the second massive boundary that the documentary says Barak systematically dismantled, which is the concept of standing.
Right. Standing, known in Hebrew as zeshut hamida, is a foundational pillar of almost any standard legal. Historically, the rule is very simple. You can only petition a court for relief if you have been directly, personally, and tangibly harmed by the action you are suing over.
Right. It's about having skin in the game.
Exactly.
Like if the government decides to build a toxic waste dump in my actual backyard, I have standing to sue them because I am directly harmed.
Your property value tanks, your health is at risk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if the government builds that exact same toxic waste dump 300 miles away from me, and I just read about it in the morning newspaper and think to myself, well, that's a terrible environmental policy, I do not have standing.
Nope.
I'm a concerned citizen, sure, but I can't sue because I am not directly injured.
And that was the universal rule. and it kept courts focused on resolving actual dispute between real parties. But the documentary details how Barak aggressively pulverized this doctrine of standing.
Okay, how did you do that?
He opened the massive wooden doors of the Supreme Court to what the source refers to as public petitioner. Over time, he allowed almost anyone, whether it was a political NGO, an activist group, or just an individual completely untouched by the specific issue at hand, to sue the government over its policy.
To put that into perspective, imagine if a minority political party loses a massive vote in Congress over a controversial new tax law.
Okay.
Under normal democratic rules, they lost the vote. The debate is over until the next election.
Right, you take the L and go home.
But in a system without the requirement of standing, that same losing party can just walk across the street from the Parliament building, hand their exact same political arguments to a judge, and ask for a recount in a courtroom where they only need to convince a handful of unelected people instead of an entire legislative body.
That is the exact critique the source is hammering home. The filmmakers argue this was a highly calculated strategic move by Barak to fortify the ultimate power of the legal establishment.
Wow.
By eliminating the requirement for direct harm, he essentially created a backdoor for political loot. Anyone who simply disliked a democratic outcome, a policy passed by the elected government, a military operation, a budget allocation, they could immediately run to the Supreme Court to try and get it.
It turns the court into a super legislature. Like a second parliament with veto power over the first one.
Precisely. Now, to maintain our impartiality and fulfill the mission of this deep dive, we really have to look at the defense Barak offers for this move, which is included in the source text.
Okay, yeah, what's his side of this?
Barak did not do this purely for a power grab, according to his own philosophy. He argues that this liberalization of standing was an absolute moral necessity to protect human rights.
How so?
He fundamentally believed that if you restrict who can sue vulnerable populations, people who are marginalized, imprisoned, or lack the resources to advocate for themselves, they will suffer horrific abuses because no one will be allowed their plight.
Okay. The source also highlights a deeply pragmatic, almost geopolitical benefit that Barak points to, which I found totally fascinating.
Oh, the internationally.
Yes. He argues that having a strong, highly activist, open-door Supreme Court actually serves as a vital protective shield for Israeli soldiers and politicians against prosecution by international court, like the International Criminal Court in The Hague.
Yes, he is invoking a concept in international law known as the principle of complementarity.
Yeah.
The way international tribunals usually is that they will only step in and claim jurisdiction if a country's internal domestic legal system is deemed unwilling or unable to invest itself.
Okay.
Barak's argument is brilliant in its pragmatism. He says, by cultivating a Supreme Court that will hear a petition from absolutely anyone, even, say, a Palestinian resident of Gaza or the West Bank suing the Israeli military, Israel can prove to the international community that it possesses a uniquely robust, fiercely independent internal review system.
So the ICC has no excuse to step in.
Exactly. Therefore, The Hague has no legal justification to intervene. The domestic court handles.
Okay, if we're analyzing the documentary's critique, doesn't Barak make an incredibly fair, strategic point there?
He does.
Like if closing the doors of the Supreme Court and returning to strict standing rules suddenly leaves Israeli soldiers and generals vulnerable to being dragged to international tribunals, isn't this open-door activism actually just a necessary strategic shield for the country?
Yeah.
It sounds like he built a legal Iron Dome.
This raises an important question, and it's one of the most hotly debated, intellectual-rich aspects of higher saga. Is the activist court an international shield? Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Even international legal scholars and harsh critics of Israel acknowledge that the Israeli Supreme Court has acted as a highly effective buffer against international tribunals. The court commands immense global weight. But the documentary's core claim is that this mechanism, regardless of its original intent as an international shield, was rapidly weaponized as a domestic political.
I see. So sure, the open-door policy keeps The Hague away, which the military loves.
Right.
But it simultaneously grants the court the power to micromanage every single decision the elected government makes at home.
Exactly. The source argues that the price the Israeli public paid for that international shield was the total domestic surrender of democratic power to the judge. Once anyone could sue over anything, the legal advisors and the judges held a skeleton key to every political office. And to truly grasp how immense and intrusive this power became, the documentary shifts from theory to practice, looking at how this leverage was applied directly against the executive branch.
Which brings us to a massive historical political scandal in 1977, the Yitzhak Rabin dollar affair.
Yes.
To understand the mechanics of power here, we really have to set the scene. The year is 1977. Yitzhak Rabin is the Prime Minister of Israel, a towering historical figure in his own right.
Absolutely.
A scandal breaks when it's discovered by a journalist that Rabin's wife, Leah Rabin, has a foreign currency account, specifically a U.S. dollar account in a bank in Washington, D.C.
Right. Left over from when Rabin served as the ambassador.
Right. Now, today, in a globalized economy, nobody would blink an eye at this. But in 1977, Israel had incredibly strict, socialist-leaning financial laws. Holding a foreign currency account abroad was actually illegal. It was designed to prevent capital flight.
Right. It was a clear breach of currency regulations. So the state apparatus goes to work. A Treasury committee, working alongside the police, investigates the matter thoroughly. They look at the facts, they look at the law, and their official recommendation is to treat it as a standard regulatory breach. They recommend imposing a heavy financial penalty.
Which logically makes sense. It's a white-collar financial regulation issue. Pay the fine, admit the mistake, and move on.
Yeah.
But Aharon Barak, who's a central player in this drama long before he becomes a Supreme Court judge,
Right.
He is serving as the Attorney General at the time, he looks at this recommendation and completely rejects it.
He overrules the committee entirely, and the source details a deeply dramatic, behind closed doors.
What happened?
Barak, acting as the appointed Attorney General, goes directly to Prime Minister Rabin, the democratically elected, and gives him two brutal choices. He says, either you resign from office immediately, or I, as your Attorney General, am going to ensure that a criminal indictment is filed against your wife and potentially you in court.
That's intense. The text notes that Barak essentially tells the Prime Minister, if you choose to fight this in court, I might even be the one personally standing up there arguing the case against you.
It was an unprecedented flex of legal authority. And Rabin, recognizing the political optics and seeing that the highest legal officer in his own government is threatening to prosecute his family, he feels he is backed into an inescapable corner.
Right.
He chooses the first option. He resigns. The Prime Minister of Israel steps down over a regulatory currency violation because the Attorney General forced his hand.
The source uses this historical moment not just as an interesting anecdote, but to highlight a terrifying mechanic of power. Think about the checks and balances in your own country's government. Think about how difficult it is to remove a head of state. What does it mean for a democracy when a single appointed legal advisor has the unilateral, unchecked power to look at a financial committee's recommendation for a fine, throw it in the trash, and use the sheer threat of a criminal trial to force a prime minister out of office?
The documentary frames this specific event in 1977 as a crucial psychological turning point for Barak and the legal establishment.
How so?
Well, notice a key detail here. Barak was not directly personally harmed by Leah Rabin's bank account in Washington.
Oh, right.
Yet he used the machinery of the legal system to topple a sitting government. The source argues this was the exact moment Barak fully realized raw, unadulterated power.
Wow.
It solidified his belief that to maintain ultimate control, he would eventually need to break down the standing doctrine when he got to court, ensuring that the legal establishment could intervene in any political crisis at any time.
Because if anyone can sue, or if the Attorney General can intervene in any matter, then the legal establishment always has a loaded weapon resting on the table during any political negotiation.
Precise. Once that requirement for direct harm vanishes, the legal establishment suddenly holds leverage over every elected official.
Right.
But the documentary makes a terrifying pivot here. The power to topple a prime minister as an attorney general by threatening prosecution under an existing law, even a minor archaic currency law, is one thing.
It's aggressive, but it's grounded in a written statute.
Exactly. However, as Barak later moved from Attorney General to the President of the Supreme Court, the documentary claims he realized he needed an even more flexible weapon. He developed a subjective tool that allowed the court to strike down government actions even when no law had been broken ever.
And this leads us to what is widely considered the most controversial, explosive legal doctrine in Israeli history, the doctrine of reasonableness.
Yeah.
To understand how this works, we jump forward in time to 1993. We have a new political crisis. A powerful government minister named Aryeh Deri is facing a severe criminal indictment for corruption.
Right.
However, Yitzhak Rabin, who has managed to return to power as prime minister, looks at the political chessboard and flat out refuses to fire Deri. Rabin says, essentially, He hasn't been convicted of anything yet. He is entitled to the presumption of innocence. And more importantly, I need his political party in my coalition to govern and advance the peace process I'm keeping.
From a purely legalistic standpoint, based on the laws written at the time, Rabin was entirely within his rights.
Right.
The written law in 1993 explicitly stated that only the prime minister held the authority to fire a cabinet. It was a matter left solely to the prime minister's political discretion.
If the voters didn't like his discretion, they could punish him in the next election.
Exactly. The Supreme Court, under the influence of Barak's philosophy, intervened.
And they don't just intervene, they invent a completely new rule out of thin air. They issue a decree stating that Prime Minister Rabin must fire Minister Derry.
The source emphasizes how radical this was because it directly contradicted the actual written text of the law. The court bypassed the Knesset's legislation by birthing this new doctrine of reasonableness, or in Hebrew, Eilat HaSvir.
Reasonableness.
Right. The judges looked at the situation and decided that it simply wasn't reasonable for a minister under severe indictment to remain in office.
Okay.
Therefore, the prime minister's decision not to fire him was deemed profoundly unreasonable. And because it was unreasonable, the court declared it legally invalid.
The source is brutally hard in its critique of this exact moment. They point out that what the court actually did was surgically separate authority from discretion.
Yes.
The judges are essentially looking down at the prime minister and saying, yes, we acknowledge the written law says you and only you have the authority to fire a minister. We grant you that. But we hold the ultimate discretion on how you are allowed to use that authority.
And the documentary utilizes a very visceral, highly memorable analogy to describe this dynamic. They call it the sock puppet.
The sock puppet analogy is brilliant. The source argues that by using reasonableness, the court reaches its hand into the head of the elected official and speaks through their throat.
Yeah.
They turn democratically elected ministers into empty, lifeless shells who are forced to act on the judge's behalf, even if the action directly contradicts the minister's own political promises, their voters' wishes, or their own political survival.
And this is where we have to dive into the philosophical abyss of this doctrine, because the expert interviewed in the documentary poses a fantastic, devastating question. Where do you study what is...
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Right.
The thing about how we use that word in everyday life. If I sue a surgeon for malpractice, a judge or a jury can determine that the surgeon acted reasonably because there are objective, universally accepted medical standards.
Exactly.
You can call 5 other surgeons to the stand as expert witnesses to testify about the standard of care. But political reasonableness.
Yeah.
How do you measure that? If a government decides to allocate billions of dollars to build a new highway instead of funding public schools, is that unreasonable?
Well, to a teacher, it is.
Right. Yeah. To a truck driver, it's not.
Yeah.
Isn't reasonableness in a political context just a polite, fancy legal costume for a judge's personal, subjective worldview?
You have zeroed in on the exact core of the documentary's outrage. The source text argues exactly that. There is no university course on political reasonableness.
Oh.
You cannot get a degree in it. Because deciding whether a political appointment, a diplomatic treaty, or a budget allocation is reasonable is fundamentally not a legal question. It is a question of political worldview, priorities, and values.
It's just an opinion. It's 5 people in robes saying, we think this is a bad idea.
Exactly the point the filmmakers make. The source argues that by cloaking their personal political opinions in the authoritative, legal-sounding term reasonableness, the judges granted themselves a godlike power. They gave themselves the ability to strike down literally any government action, any appointment, or any policy they personally disagreed with without ever having to point to a single broken law.
Because they just call it unreasonable.
Right. They didn't need the parliament to pass a law prohibiting an action. They just needed to declare the action unreasonable.
Okay, let's recap the mechanics of this silent revolution so far. Barak expands what can be judged by saying there are no black holes in the law.
Check.
He expands who can sue by pulverizing the requirement for direct harm.
Check.
And he invents a totally subjective standard, reasonableness, to strike down executive decisions he doesn't like. But taking total control over executive decisions was apparently just the warm-up act.
Oh, yeah.
Because in 1995, the court leveled its sights on the legislative branch itself.
Yes. We are now arriving at the absolute zenith of the documentary, the moment that permanently fractured the 1995 Bank Mizrahi.
Right.
This is the moment Aharon Barak officially openly declared what he called the constitutional revolution.
We need to provide some crucial historical context here, because this is where the Israeli system differs wild from the Americans and many Europeans. Israel famously does not have a formal single-document constitution.
That's right.
When the state was founded in 1948 by David Ben-Gurion, they were in the middle of a war for survival. Ben-Gurion knew that trying to draft a constitution that appeased both secular socialists and ultra-Orthodox religious faction would trigger a catastrophic culture war that could tear the newborn state apart.
It would have been a disaster.
Yeah. So he punted. He made a compromise. Instead of one big Knesset, the parliament would pass a series of basic laws over the coming decade, dealing with different aspects of government, with the idea that maybe someday they would be stitched together into a constitution.
Right.
But for a very long time, these basic laws were just treated like regular law. The parliament could pass them, change them, or ignore them with a simple majority vote.
That was the status quo until Bank Mizrahi. The actual case itself was seemingly mundane. It dealt with agricultural debt relief for farming communities. But Barak used this incredibly dry financial case as the vehicle to drop a nuclear bomb on Israeli constitutional law. In this ruling, Barak declared that these basic laws were no longer just regular law.
What did you say they were?
He decreed that they actually hold supreme constitutional status. And because they hold con status, the Supreme Court now possesses the ultimate power of
Judicial review.
Right, the power to strike down any regular law passed by the Knesset if the court feels it contradicts law.
He unilaterally gave the court the ultimate veto power over the parliament. But the expert in the documentary breaks down the deep, lingering controversy of how these specific basic laws were actually passed in the first place, and this blew my mind.
That's a crazy story.
Yeah, we are talking specifically about two laws passed in 1992, most notably the Basic Law, human dignity and liberty.
The source zeroes in on the voting numbers in the Knesset that night. This document, Barak 3 years later would elevate to the status supreme, unassailable constitution, was passed with only 32 votes in favor and 23 opposed.
Wait, let's do the math on that.
Yep.
There are 120 members in the Israeli Knesset.
Yes.
You were telling me that a foundational law, a law that would be used to give an unelected court the power to strike down the will of the parliament, was passed when less than half the parliament even bothered to show up to vote.
Yeah.
It passed with a quarter of the total legislature.
That is exactly the shocking reality the documentary is highlighting. It begs the question, why was attendance so remarkably low for the birth of a nation's constitution?
Right.
The source alleges, with historical backing, that the members of Knesset were explicitly and repeatedly told by the sponsors of the bill that these laws were merely declared.
What do you mean?
They were told, relax, this is just a nice symbolic statement of our democratic value. It does not give the courts any new powers to strike down legislation.
So the lawmakers thought they were voting on the equivalent of a ceremonial resolution, like something you frame and put on the wall, not a legal weapon that would be used again.
According to the source, yes. The lawmakers were either deceived or profoundly ignorant of the implication. But 3 years later, Barak used those exact laws to declare his constitutional revolution.
Wow.
The legal mechanism he used is brilliant, but highly controversial. He used a concept we can call implied supremacy.
Okay.
Even though the 1992 Knesset didn't exactly right, the court can now strike. Barak argued that because the Basic Law enshrined human dignity, any regular law that violated that dignity was implicit void, and the court had the inherent duty to. The documentary quotes former Supreme Court President Moshe Landau, who was a contemporary of Barak and was horrified by the.
What did he say?
Landau noted that if these basic laws are indeed a constitution, it is the only constitution in the history of the free world created entirely by the words of a court, rather than through a massive public referendum or a deliberate supermajority vote by the people.
I mean, think about the creation of the United States Constitution.
Yeah.
Years of agonizing debate, the Federalist Papers, massive state conventions, grueling ratification processes where the public was hyper-aware of what was at stake. And in Israel, it was 32 guys in a half-empty room at night who thought they were passing a declarative statement, followed by a judge 3 years later popping out and saying, surprise, you accidentally wrote a constitution, and I'm in charge of it now.
Now, to maintain our commitment to impartiality, we must examine Barak's defense against this brutal critique, which is also presented.
Oh, yeah. How does he defend that?
Barak does not see himself as a usurper. He argues that in any modern, functioning democracy, the fundamental job of the Supreme Court is to interpret the law. He directly compares his actions to the role of the United Supreme Court.
No.
He points out that the U.S. Supreme Court interprets vague concepts like the right to bear arms or the right to privacy and abortion. And while people argue over the rulings, nobody seriously claims the judges are overthrowing the U.S. government.
Right.
They are simply executing their duty to interpret the Constitution. Barak claims he didn't invent anything. He merely implemented the logical consequences of what the legislators themselves wrote down in 1992. If they didn't understand the power of their own words, that's the parliament's fault, not.
That's a strong defense, but I have to wonder if that comparison holds up. Isn't there a massive fundamental tension in that U.S. comparison?
What do you mean?
When the American public ratified their Constitution, or when any nation votes on a Constitution, they are collectively agreeing to a social contract. They are consciously setting the boundaries of their own political rights and agreeing to limit the power of their own future maturities. They know exactly what they're signing up for.
And that is the precise counterargument the source makes to demolish Barak's defense. A constitution derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed.
Yes.
But the documentary fiercely argues that the Israeli public never agrees. They were never asked. There was no referendum, no grand national debate about getting the court veto power.
Right.
Therefore, the source concludes a small council of unelected judges essentially decided for the public what their limits are, hijacking the nation's sovereignty without its consent.
Which brings us to a really uncomfortable but necessary question. If this small group of people, these 15 Supreme Court justices, holds all this unprecedented, seemingly unchecked power over the military, the prime minister, the economy, and the parliament, who decides who gets to join that exclusive group? Who is guarding the gates to the most powerful room in the country?
And that leads us to the internal culture of the Supreme Court, which the documentary attacks with absolute ferocity. The filmmakers describe the court during and after Barak's tenure as an impenetrable, self-selecting echo chamber. Because for decades, the system for appointing judges in Israel gave the existing Supreme Court justices an effective veto over.
To illustrate how this gatekeeping worked, the source spends a lot of time on the story of Professor Ruth Gavin.
Yes, she is a prime example.
She really is. We are talking about a woman who is a brilliant legal scholar, an Israel Prize winner in law, and deeply respected across the academic world. But philosophically, she believed in democracy as the rule of the public. She believed the court should be restrained, and she openly intellectually criticized Barak's aggressive judicial activism.
She was a formidable intellectual rival. Right. And when her name naturally came up as a prime candidate to be appointed to the Supreme Court, Aharon Barak publicly and forcefully blocked her appointment.
And his reason was wild.
His stated reason for blocking this brilliant legal mind, he famously declared she has.
The hypocrisy alleged by the source here is staggering. Barak blocked her for having an agenda, completely ignoring the blaring reality that his entire tenure, this massive, unprecedented constitutional revolution, the obliteration of standing, the invention of reasonableness, it was all driven by a massive revolutionary agenda of his own.
The documentary uses the Gavison incident to imply that the court was not acting like a diverse panel of legal minds, but rather like an exclusive Orthodox religious cult or a temple.
A temple?
Yeah, they were fiercely protecting their holy space from a heresy.
Yeah.
If you didn't worship at the altar of judicial activism, if you didn't subscribe to Barak's worldview, you were simply not allowed in the building.
And it wasn't just ideological gatekeeping. The source dives deep into accusations of outright structural nepotism. They describe a system where a friend brings a friend. They detail instances of judges' children getting highly prestigious clerking jobs for other sitting Supreme Court judges, creating an insular inherited elite.
Right.
They even point out that Barak's own wife was appointed as the deputy president of the National Labor Court.
The documentary uses these examples to paint a devastating picture of an elite insular club looking out for its own members while dictating morality to the mass. And they also touch on a deep, highly sensitive demographic context.
What was that?
The source points out that during this era of massive judicial expansion, the court was overwhelmingly Ashkenazi, meaning Jews of European descent.
Okay.
The filmmakers ask a pointed question. Why weren't there more Sephardic judges, judges of Middle Eastern or North African descent who make up a massive portion of the Israeli working class on the Supreme Court?
Now, Barak is actually quoted defending this track record in the text. Yeah. He says they desperately looked for the best candidates, but they just couldn't find Sephardic candidates who met their rigorous criteria at the time. He explicitly and adamantly denies any ill will, racism, or intentional exclusion.
He does deny it, and many believe his denial is sincere. But the source views this defense as the ultimate damning proof of elitist gate.
How so?
The underlying critique is that the definition of the best was entirely subjective, and suspiciously, the best always seemed to look exactly like people who came from the same exact affluent neighborhood, attended the same universities, and held the same exact left-leaning political views as Barak himself. The court was cloning.
Wait, the text also mentions Barak acknowledging that the nepotism of the past, like where judges' kids clerked for each other, was a mistake and was fixed 20 years ago.
Sure.
Doesn't that show a system capable of self-correction?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the source argues the formal nepotism may have ended, but the ideological gatekeeping remains. Just the expert interviewed in the source text explains that this nepotism didn't disappear, it just evolved over time into something harder to track.
Like what?
They claim it's no longer just obvious blood relations, but rather a strict ideological nepotism. The claim is that if you want to be promoted through the ranks of the state attorney's office or eventually reach the Supreme Court today, you must fiercely protect the clique.
Right.
You must prove your loyalty to the court's predominant world. The filmmakers argue that the system didn't self-correct its immense power. It merely got much smarter and more sophisticated about how it filters out dissenting voices like Ruth Gavesson before they ever get near the levers of power.
So what does this all mean? If you are listening to this and you are trying to synthesize all this information, what does this all mean for the concept of governance?
Yeah, that's the big question.
We've traced the man, Aharon Barak, and the psychological weight of his history. We've explored his philosophy of the visionary judge who believes law fills all spaces.
Right.
We've looked deeply at the legal mechanics he allegedly used, expanding justiciability, obliterating the requirement of standing, and inventing the subjective tool of reasonableness to bypass written law.
And we looked at the gatekeeping?
Yes, the insular culture of the court that jealously guards this immense power. So where does this leave Israel's democracy today, and what can the rest of the world learn from?
Well, the documentary paints a stark, terrifying picture of a nation where the ultimate locus of power shifted fundamentally and permanently from the ballot box courtroom.
Wow.
It argues that Aharon Barak rewired the system so thoroughly that the elected representatives, the people the voters actually chose, are essentially subordinate to the jury. The politicians manage the daily bureaucracy, but the judge is state.
And whether you are listening to this from a country with a rigid, centuries-old written constitution or a flexible parliamentary system, this story is an absolute masterclass in how fragile the balance of power truly is.
It really is.
It forces you to look at the structure of your own government and ask a terrifying question. Who really holds the ultimate, unquestionable authority in your society?
Yeah.
And how easily could that authority be subtly shifted, redefined, and captured without a single citizen ever casting a vote to approve it?
There is one final, highly provocative thought I want to pull from the very end of the documentary, mull over as we wrap up.
Okay, lay it on.
The source material ends with some extreme, highly charged rhetoric from critics of the court who feel completely disenfranchised. They use apocalyptic language.
Like what?
They talk about military pilots refusing to serve. They talk about social collapse, and they even warn of the destruction of the Third Temple, which is a deeply resonant historical metaphor for the fall of the modern state of Israel.
Oh.
They say all this will happen if the court's absolute power is seriously challenged by the elected politicians.
That is heavy apocalyptic language. It sounds like a society on the brink of tearing itself apart because the pressure valves of democracy have been sealed shut.
It is grim, but it raises the ultimate, inescapable question of this entire debate, a question every democracy must answer.
Which is?
When a society increasingly relies on a small group of unelected elite guardians to protect democracy from the whims of the politics who is left to protect democracy guardian.
That's a great point.
And more importantly, if a massive segment of the voting public entirely loses faith in those guardians, as this documentary clearly shows they have, can the system survive the inevitable backlash?
Remember that image we started with, a country where the ultimate deciders are unelected officials sitting behind a mahogany bench wielding power without accountability to the voter.
Right.
The question isn't just whether they make the right or wrong decisions on any given day. The question is, what happens to the fabric of a nation when the people finally decide they no longer want those guardians making the decisions at all?
Exactly.
Imagine a freezing night, right? December 1992.
Oh, yeah. The atmosphere in Israel at that moment was just at an absolute boiling point.
Exactly. I mean, a border police officer, Nissim Koladano, has just been kidnapped and murdered by Hamas.
Right. A horrific event.
Yeah. And the government, which is led by Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin at the time, they decide they have to deliver this unprecedented, crushing response. They need to restore deterrence.
They needed a massive show of force.
Right. So in the dead of night, they mobilize this huge military and security apparatus. I mean, they load 415 suspected Hamas terrorists onto buses.
Just a massive logistical undertaking.
Huge. And the plan is to deport them across the northern border into Lebanon. So the engines are running, the military commanders have their orders, the whole national security establishment is in full motion.
Ready to go.
And then, out of nowhere, the entire operation just grinds to a screeching, chaotic halt.
And not because of, a military counterattack or anything like that.
No, not at all. Not a logistical failure either. It stops because a single man, the duty judge on the Supreme Court, that night issues an interim injunction ordering the military to stop.
Which is just wild to think about.
It really is. And the reason, the 415 suspects hadn't been granted a prior administrative hearing.
Yeah, and I mean, it is one of the most defining moments in modern legal history. It just perfectly encapsulates the collision we are unpacking today.
Absolutely. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
You basically have the raw, kinetic momentum of a state's security apparatus colliding head head-on with this absolute unyielding wall of judicial review.
It's a massive clash.
And what's fascinating is that the judge in question, he didn't look at the logistics or the intelligence or, the ticking clock of a terror crisis. He looked strictly at the administrative procedure.
Right, which brings us to our topic. Today, we are opening up this incredibly charged, highly polarized piece of source material.
It's a heavy one.
It really is. We're looking at a comprehensive critique, originally presented as an investigative video, that just dissects the legacy of that exact judge, Aharon Barak.
The former president of the Israeli Supreme Court.
Exactly. And, before we get deep into the weeds of constitutional law and military rules of engagement, I want to be perfectly clear with you, the listener, about our mission today.
Yeah, this is crucial.
It is. This source material represents a blistering, predominantly right-leaning critique of Israel's judicial system.
It really touches a nerve that is actively burning in geopolitical debates right now.
Oh, 100%. So our job here is not to take a side.
Yeah.
We aren't endorsing these critiques, and we aren't dismissing the fierce left-leaning defenses of the court that the material also covers.
Right. We are acting purely as analysts here.
Exactly. We are just mapping the architecture of these arguments so you can understand the mechanics of how a modern democracy, fractures under pressure.
And to really understand that fracture, you have to understand the philosophical earthquake that Aharon Barak triggered in the early 90s.
Right. He coined a very specific phrase.
He did. Back in 1992, he coined a phrase that became the absolute bedrock of this new legal reality. He said, "The whole earth is filled with law."
The whole earth is filled with law.
Yeah. And in constitutional terms, this translates to the doctrine that absolutely everything is justiciable.
Okay, let's unpack this, because for anyone used to a traditional separation of powers, like in the U.S. or the U.K., that doctrine sounds incredibly expansive.
Oh, it's massive.
Right. Because if everything is justiciable, it means there is no political question, no executive privilege, and no military tactical decision that sits outside the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court.
Nothing is off limits.
Exactly. And the critics in our source material, they trace this exact philosophy from its triumphant rollout in 1992 all the way to a complete institutional breakdown in 2026.
Yeah, to the point where Barak himself declares the country is, quote, no longer a democracy.
It's a staggering arc. I mean, truly. So let's explore how that philosophy actually functions when it drops out of the ivory tower and lands right on the battlefield.
Right. Because the critique argues that when you apply "the whole earth is filled with law" to actual warfare, you fundamentally alter the nature of national security.
You change the entire game.
Exactly. Let's go back to that 1992 deportation of the 415 Hamas operatives. The Supreme Court looked at a real-time, unfolding military response terror wave and essentially demanded peacetime administrative protocol.
Which is a huge ask in them.
It is. The source emphasizes that nobody on the bench stopped to ask the practical question. Is holding 415 individual legal hearings in the middle of a massive, time-sensitive security crisis even physically possible?
Right. Where do you even hold them? Who are the lawyers?
Exactly. But the law was applied with absolute strictness, and it entirely paralyzed the executive branch.
Which brings up a massive question of competency. I was thinking about this dynamic, and I think I came up with an analogy based on the text.
Oh, let's hear it.
Okay, so think about an F-16 fighter jet in the middle of a chaotic dogfight.
Okay. High stakes.
Super high stake. You have a pilot who has to make these split-second life-or-death decisions based on instinct, training, and immediate radar data.
Right, they're moving at Mach 2.
Exactly. Now, imagine putting a brilliant air traffic controller, someone who knows every single FAA regulation, every altitude restriction, every noise ordinance by heart, into the backseat of that F-16.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Right. And you tell the pilot, hey, you cannot fire a missile or execute a dive until the air traffic controller reviews the maneuver to ensure it perfectly aligns with civilian airspace guidelines.
Which is a disaster waiting to happen.
Complete disaster. The air traffic controller is undeniably brilliant in their domain,
Fair.
but they are entirely unequipped to survive a dogfight. But forcing the pilot to wait for legal clearance, you basically guarantee the plane gets shot down.
That analogy strikes right at the heart of the documentary's thesis. I mean, the argument isn't that the judges are incompetent or malicious.
Not at all.
Right. It's that they are operating so far outside their realm of operational that their intervention becomes active.
Because they're applying the wrong rule book.
The legal mind is trained to weigh abstract right, to consider precedent and to ensure procedural fairness.
Which takes time.
A lot of time. But the military mind is trained to neutralize threats and manage kinetic risk. When the Supreme Court assumes the power to dictate real-time decisions, the critics argue, you suffer a catastrophic misallocation of authority.
And what's really insidious about this, and the source material spends a lot of time on this exact mechanic, is how this power actually manifests day to day.
Right. It's not always in the headlines.
Exactly. It's not always a dramatic midnight injunction. The court didn't need to write a formal ruling every time they wanted to stop an operation. The real power was exercised through this, like, shadow mechanic.
Yeah, the documentary describes this as the chilling effect.
The chilling effect.
And what's fascinating here is how institutional gravity just distorts behavior. The court realized that issuing formal written rulings restricting military action could sometimes spark public backlash.
Or legislative pushback, right. Politicians getting angry.
Exactly. So they utilized the legal process itself as a weapon. During a petition against a military operation, the judges wouldn't necessarily issue a final verdict.
Wait, so what would they do?
Instead, they would just signal the government's lawyer. They would, raise a skeptical eyebrow from the bench or suggest to the defense minister's representatives that perhaps the rules of engagement should be reevaluated to avoid a ruling.
Wow. So it's the ultimate soft power.
It really is.
Because the military commanders know that the high court is perpetually hovering over their heads, so they don't even wait for the gavel to strike. They preemptively self-censor.
Exactly. They alter their tactical plans, pull back their troops, or just cancel operations entirely just to appease the court and avoid the humiliation.
And the source explicitly argues that this creates a reality where the court wields immense absolute power over national security, but without leaving a paper trail.
Right. There's no formal ruling to appeal. The military just internalizes the legal paralysis.
And we see the combination of this dynamic in the late 90s and early 2000s, right? The source points to two massive legal landmarks that fundamentally rewrote Israeli military doctrine.
Yeah, these are huge. The first is the 1999 ruling on Shin Bet interrogation.
Okay, break that down.
So the court ruled that physical pressure could only be utilized in incredibly narrow, exceptional...
Like the classic ticking time bomb scenario.
Exactly, where an attack is imminent and highly...
Now, for a lot of people listening, especially from Western liberal democracies, that ruling sounds like a standard, necessary human rights victory. Like, of course you shouldn't use physical pressure normally.
It does sound like. And the source actually acknowledges that Aharon Barak considers these rulings his crown jewel. His supporters globally view this as the ultimate proof that Israel maintains its democratic soul, even under terror.
Right, but there's a flip side in the text.
There is. The critics in our source material pair this immediately with the court's landmark ruling on targeted killings.
This one is intense.
It really is. The Supreme Court established this binding legal test. They said the military can only execute a targeted aerial strike against a terrorist operative if there is, quote, no practical alternative to insert ground troops and arrest the suspect.
Okay, let's really dig into the mechanics of that phrase, no practical alternative. Because, abstract legal phrasing has an actual body count when applied to urban warfare.
It absolutely does.
Imagine you are a brigade commander, right? And you have actionable intelligence on a senior terrorist mastermind sitting in a heavily fortified apartment in a hostile, dense urban center.
A nightmare scenario.
Total nightmare. You have a drone overhead. You can end the threat right then and there with zero risk to your soldiers. But the Supreme Court has mandated that you must first evaluate a ground arrest.
Right.
You have to ask yourself,
Sure.
Could I send a squad of 20 19-year-old soldiers into that labyrinth of booby-trapped alleys, initiate a massive firefight, risk their lives, and arrest him?
And if the answer is technically yes, it's possible, the court's doctrine suggests you must take the risk of sending the ground troops rather than taking the shot from the air.
Which is just a brutal calculation to force on a commander.
It is. And the documentary makes a fierce, specific claim here. They say there is no other liberal democracy on earth where a civilian Supreme Court inserts itself so deeply into the granular, tactical risk management arithmetic of warfare.
Right, because in the U.S. or the U.K. or France, these deeply specific operational questions are governed by internal military lawyers.
The chain of command.
Yeah, and ultimately the elected executive branch. The courts historically stay out of the fog of war.
They usually defer to military expertise.
Right. So the critique is that the judiciary has essentially handcuffed the executive's ability to protect the state, paralyzing the military with the fear of retroactive legal prosecution.
Exactly.
But, if the court is willing to boss around the generals and dictate the terms of warfare, how does it handle the politicians who are supposed to be overseeing those generals?
Well, this is a great pivot. Because if everything is justiciable, then the ballot box, the parliament, and the democratic process itself must also be under the court's jurisdiction.
Right.
Precisely. And this is where the documentary pivots from the military theater into the political arena. The argument is that the Supreme Court positioned itself as the ultimate unchecked gatekeepers of the democratic process.
Like literally deciding who is and isn't allowed to even run for the Knesset, Israel's parliament.
Yes. And the source illustrates this with a stark, almost unbelievable dichotomy. We get a tale of two politicians that exposes what the critics call a massive systemic double standard.
Okay, I remember this from the text. Let's look at politician A first.
Right.
Azmi Bishara.
Right. Azmi Bashar.
The year is 2001. Bashara is a sitting member of the Knesset. He travels to Syria, which is an enemy state.
An active enemy state.
Yeah, and he gives a speech where he publicly praises Hezbollah, a recognized terror organization, and he actively calls for the expansion of the armed struggle against the state of Israel.
Now, under Israeli basic law, specifically, Section 7A candidates or parties can be disqualified from running for the Knesset for...
Right, what are the rules?
Basically, if they negate the existence of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, they incite racism, or, the key one, if they support an armed struggle by an enemy state or terror organ.
Okay, well, Bashar's actions seem to explicitly trigger that third clause. I mean, he's literally in Syria praising Hezbollah. So he is facing trial and disqualification.
Right. But the Supreme Court intervened. They not only halt his trial, they authorize him to run for parliament. The court effectively decides that his explicit support for an armed struggle against the state is protected.
Which is wild. It's just wild. And to add a bitter postscript, the source notes that Bashara later fled Israel entirely because he was suspected of
Yeah, passing target coordinates to Hezbollah during the 2006 Lebanon war.
Unbelievable. And today, he sits in Qatar. So the court protected a man who literally supported the country's armed enemy. Now, let's look at politician B, representing the other side of the spectrum, Michael Ben-Ari.
Right, so Ben-Ari is a far-right political figure. The source highlights that he used deeply inflammatory, racist, and extremist rhetoric.
Yeah, it was pretty awful stuff.
Specifically, he was cited for making statements predicting that Gazans would one day breach the borders and slaughter Israelis.
Okay, so when his candidacy was challenged, what did the court?
The Supreme Court brought the hammer down. They completely disqualified him from running for the Knesset based on the incitement to racism clause, and the source notes he's currently facing criminal.
Okay, so if we synthesize this through the lens of the critic, the Supreme Court acts as a bouncer at the club of democracy.
That's a good way to put it.
Right, but it's a bouncer with a very specific political agenda. They let the guy in who explicitly supports the armed enemies trying to burn the club down, but they throw out the guy on the right who uses extremist rhetoric.
And the critics are arguing that the court is actively gerrymandering the ideological makeup of the parliament.
Wow.
And that leads the documentary to a profound political science. The critics argue that because of this ideological gatekeeping, Israel ceased to be a true liberal democracy and morphed into what they call a high borderline.
A hybrid regime, that's a heavy term.
There you have.
The source explicitly clarifies it's not calling Israel a totalitarian dictatorship like North Korea, right?
Right.
But it's saying it falls short of the liberal democratic standard. Why exactly?
Because the absolute foundational pillar of a liberal democracy is the equality of political rights. The sovereign is the elected.
Right, the voters decide.
Yeah. Exactly. But if you have an unelected judicial body that systematically protects the political rights of one end of the spectrum while severely curtailing the rights of the other, well, the electorate is no longer fully sovereign.
Because their choices are being artificially limited.
Yes. The court is essentially curating the options available to the voter, shaping the parliament in its own image.
I have to challenge this logic for a second, though, because any political junkie listening is going to immediately think about checks and balances.
Sure, of course.
The entire point of a constitutional democracy is that the majority cannot just do whatever it wants. You need a Supreme Court to be the check on crazy politicians.
Right.
You need someone to stop the tyranny of the majority.
That is the standard defense.
But if the Supreme Court is the ultimate check,
yeah,
what is the check on the Supreme Court?
And that is the structural void at the center of this entire crisis. The documentary features an interview where a critic recounts asking the members of the Judicial Select, the specific body in Israel that appoints judge, that exact question.
They actually asked them.
Yes. They asked, what is the check, what is the balance upon the Supreme Court?
And what is the mechanism? What did they say?
There isn't one. According to the source, the committee members had zero answers.
Zero answers. That's incredible.
And to understand why that's so significant, you have to understand how unique Israel's judicial selection process has historically been.
Because it's not like the U.S.
Not at all. Unlike the U.S., where elected officials nominate and confirm judges, the Israeli system gave sitting Supreme Court justices an effective veto over who could join them on the bench.
Wait, so the judges were basically picking their own successors?
Essentially, yes. They replicated their own ideological worldview generation after generation. The critics argue this created a closed loop of absolute unchecked supremacy.
Man, if an institution accumulates that much unchecked power over the military, power over the ballot box, power to select its own successors, a massive institutional collision isn't just possible. It is mathematically inevitable.
It was just a matter of time.
Right. And that brings us to the boiling. Everything we've discussed so far, banning jurisprudence, the chilling effect, the political disqualification, and the match was struck in January 2023.
That was the moment the elected government, spearheaded by Justice Minister Yariv Levin, decided to strike
The judicial reform.
Exactly. They launched a massive, sweeping legislative package known as the Judicial. The goal was to systematically dismantle the absolute power of Aharon Barak.
What were the actual mechanics of the reform?
They aimed to restructure the Judicial Selection Committee to give elected officials the majority, to eliminate the court's ability to strike down government decisions based purely on the subjective standard.
Because reasonableness is just so vague.
Highly subjective. And they also wanted to introduce an override clause, allowing Parliament pass laws struck down by the court.
So it was a full-scale attempt to restore parliamentary sovereignty, and the reaction from the judicial establishment was just nuclear.
Completely unprecedented.
Aharon Barak, the architect of the system, who's 86 years old at this time, essentially comes out of retirement. He goes on this massive media blitz across every major network, and the rhetoric he uses is completely apocalyptic.
It was shocking for a man known for decades of dry, measured academic legalism. Barak didn't just critique the specific legal mechanics of Levin's reform. He warned that the reforms would bring tanks into the...
Tanks.
Yes. He described the legislation as poison. He openly warned of an impending civil war.
Which is terrifying for the public to hear.
And most intensely for the Israeli public, he compared the reforms to the beginning of the destruction of the Third Temple, which is the ultimate historical and religious metaphor for the complete annihilation.
It is stunning to hear a founding legal figure talk like that. And I love how the documentary captures Yariv Levin's reaction to this media blitz because it is just a masterclass in political judo.
It really is.
Barak goes on television and says that Levin has gathered all the worst, most dictatorial proposals and strung them together into a chain that will strangle democracy. And Levin's response is essentially, thank you.
Yeah, Levin takes the harshest possible condemnation as a total badge of honor.
His logic is flawless if you accept the critic's premise. Levin reasons that if Aharon Barak, the man who, in Levin's view, spent 30 years building an unelected dictatorship that fundamentally ignores the will of the public, if that man absolutely hates the reform, then the reform must be perfectly calibrated.
It's the ultimate validation for Levin.
Right. If the architect of the overreach is panicking, the reform is hitting exactly the right target.
But Barak escalates the rhetoric even further, crossing a line that triggers fury in the source. This raises an important question about historical comparisons.
Okay, what did he compare it?
Barak compares the situation in Israel in 2023, fall of the Weimar Republic, and the rise of Nazi Germany.
Oh, wow. That is the third rail.
It is. He argues that just as the democratic institutions in Germany were dismantled legally, piece by piece, the Israeli parliament was using democratic tools to destroy democracy itself.
And the critics in the documentary just completely unload on this historical comparison. They call it an outrageous lie. Why are they so mad about that specific comparison?
Because it fundamentally misrepresents the historical reality of how the Weimar Republic fell. The documentary points out a devastating historical truth.
Which is?
In the 1920s and 30s, the German jurists, the elite lawyers, the judges, and the legal academy were not the noble defenders holding the line for liberal democracy against a populist mob.
Wait, they weren't?
No, they were deeply conservative, anti-democratic, and they were the central catalysts for the regime's rise. They systematically undermined the Weimar Constitution from within and later provided the sophisticated legal framework that legitimized the atrocities of the Holocaust.
Wow. So the critics are looking at Barak, this brilliant legal scholar who absolutely knows his history, and they are saying, how dare you? You are arguing that we must rely on an elite class of unelected jurists to save democracy from elected politicians, when history shows us that unelected legal elites are entirely capable of enabling the worst tyrannies known to man.
The idea that a Supreme Court is inherently morally superior to a parliament is, in their eyes, historically illiterate.
Exactly. The source argues that tyranny doesn't only come from the ballot. It can just as easily come from the bench. And when Barak uses imagery like tanks and civil war, it just reveals a complete catastrophic breakdown in the basic trust required to run a state.
You really can't function as a country when the rhetoric hits that pitch.
No, you can't. We have to sit with the gravity of that for a moment. You have the political class and the judicial class looking at the exact same country, and they cannot even agree on the definition of reality. One side sees the reform as the salvation of democracy. The other sees it as the death of the state.
It's a total fracture.
It is. But to honor our commitment to analyzing this from all angles, we must look at the defenses of Aharon Barak that the documentary includes. Because as fierce as this critique is, Barak has passionate, deeply committed defenders.
He absolutely does.
Why do they believe this immense judicial power is absolutely vital? Why do they fight so hard for it?
Well, the defenders argue that you cannot look at Israel's system in a vacuum. Israel does not have a formal written constitution.
Right, just a series of basic laws.
Exactly. It has a single house of parliament, the Knesset, and the government always controls the majority of that part. Therefore, the executive and legislative branches are few.
There's no separate Senate or anything to block them?
None. The defenders argue that without an incredibly strong, activist Supreme Court, there's absolutely nothing stopping a simple majority of 61 politicians passing laws that could strip away the rights of minorities, shut down free speech, or cement their own power permanently.
So their argument is essentially a fear of the void.
Exactly, a fear of unchecked political power.
If you dismantle Barak's system, if you remove the court's ability to strike down unreasonable government action, the government will achieve raw, absolute power. So what does this all mean? For the defenders, Barak isn't a dictator. He is the boy with his finger in the dike.
They see him as the ultimate protector.
They point to his thousands of rulings over decades and argue they are infused with common sense, human rights protections, and a deep commitment to minority rights.
Right. They view the court as the sole institutional break on majoritarian tyranny. But the critics in the documentary counter this defense by pointing to the concept of accountability, and they highlight a devastating structural reality regarding another pillar of...
Yes, the Attorney General.
Yes, the subplot involving Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit.
This part of the text was it felt like a spy novel. This is where the documentary argues the legal system didn't just overreach, it's structurally rotted from the inside.
To really understand this, you have to grasp a bizarre quirk in the Israeli. In a system like the U.S., you have the White House counsel advising the president, and you have the Attorney General running the justice.
Right, they're separate jobs.
Exactly. In Israel, the Attorney General holds dual, wildly conflicting hats. They are the chief legal advisor to the government, whose advice is legally binding, and they are the head of the public prosecution.
Meaning they decide who gets indicted?
Precisely.
It's an insane concentration of power for an unelected official. I mean, think about it. You are the government's lawyer, you advise the prime minister every day, but you also have the power to put the prime minister in jail.
It's a massive conflict of interest built right in, and the documentary uses Mandelblit to show how this power corrupts.
Right. The source describes Mandelblit as one of the weakest attorney generals in history, but focuses on a specific, surreal conflict of interest. Mandelblit himself was under police investigation for alleged improprieties in a previous role.
Wait. Stop right there. The chief legal officer of the entire country, the head of the prosecution, is actively being investigated by the national...
Yes.
That is wild.
And because of his dual role, the man being investigated by the police was simultaneously the ultimate legal boss of those exact same police investigators.
Unbelievable.
He controlled their budgets, their mandates, and the legal framework of their operation. The documentary claims that a total structural collapse occurred because Mandelblit effectively operated the national police as his own private unit to protect himself and advance the prosecution of the prime.
I'm investigating you, but you are my boss, you control my career, and you decide what is... It's an impossible Kafkaesque loop.
It really is.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to the core philosophical debate. The defenders of the court say, we need the legal establishment to guard the corrupt politician. But the critics in the text point to Mandelblit and say, who guards the guards themselves?
Right. When legal figures operate with absolute power, binding authority, and zero democratic oversight, they inevitably become corrupted by that power.
Which brings us to the culmination of the documentary. We've traced the timeline from the 1992 military injunction through the political disqualifications into the 2023 apocalyptic reform battle and the structural decay of the Attorney General's office.
It's been a long journey.
It has. Where does the source claim this leaves the nation as we look toward 2026? And more importantly, how do they propose to actually fix this shattered engine?
The documentary doesn't just list grievances, it advocates for a specific structural remedy. The overarching solution proposed, changing the hegemony.
Changing the hegemony, which sounds like a polite way of saying, fire all the judges and install our guys. Is that what they mean?
The source explicitly denies that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It insists the solution is not merely replacing a left-wing judicial cartel with a right-wing cartel. The fundamental fix, they argue, is to change the DNA of how power is dealt.
Okay, so what does that look like practically?
The critical first step is appointing individuals to the centers of power, the military command, the security service, and the judiciary, who view themselves as fundamentally subordinate to the electorate.
Subordinate to the electorate. Meaning, when a military commander or a legal advisor sits in a room, their core ethos must be that they answer to the people who were voted in, not to an abstract, unelected legal elite.
Exactly. The goal is to shatter the chilling effect. They want professionals who will execute the policies of the elected government, regardless of whether that government is right-leaning or left.
They just want the government to be able to govern.
Right. The critics argue that true democracy only returns when the elected representatives can actually do their jobs without the constant looming threat of a judicial veto overriding their policy.
And mapping that proposed solution against the timeline of our source material reveals an incredibly tragic, almost Shakespearean irony in Aharon Barak's legacy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really is a profound psychological arc. Think about the journey. We started in 1990.
When he's at his...
Exact. Barak is brilliant, confident, and at the absolute height of his intellectual power. He genuinely believes that by expanding the court's reach, by declaring that the whole earth is filled with law, he is building a perfect, rational, enlightened system that will save society from the messy, corrupt whims of politicians.
He built a machine of absolute, unchecked judicial power, but he built it on the assumption that people exactly like him, measured, enlightened jurists, would always be the ones pulling the levers.
Right. But by 2026, the public has revolted, the political class has pushed back against the hegemony, and the machine has broken down.
It's all falling apart.
The same man who believed he was perfecting democracy is now staring at the wreckage of the social contract and declaring, we are no longer a democracy.
It's just devastating.
The documentary implies that Barak's extreme rhetoric, the warnings of tanks and civil war, is the sound of a man realizing that the golem he created has slipped completely out of...
I want to highlight the emotional core of this debate because it is so easy to get lost in the weeds of constitutional theory and forget that real people are living inside this friction.
Yeah, these aren't just abstract ideas.
Exactly. Towards the end of the documentary, there is a remarkably poignant moment where a citizen speaks about their underlying motivation. They talk about their father, who fought and died in previous wars to ensure the country existed so his children would have a future.
It's a very heavy legacy.
It is. And now, this citizen feels they have to fight their own government, their own institutions, to save their children's future from what they perceive as governmental tyranny.
And the true tragedy of a hyperpolarized society is that both sides feel that exact same existential dread.
They really do.
The citizens defending the court genuinely believe they're fighting a fascist takeover by right-wing politicians to save their children's future. The citizens criticizing the court genuinely believe they are fighting a dictatorial, unelected legal elite to save their children's future.
Both sides believe they are the last line of defense for democracy.
It's heartbreaking, honestly.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. I mean, we started in the freezing cold of 1992, watching a single judge halt the deportation of terrorists.
We dug into the tactical arithmetic of targeted killings and F-16 dogfights.
We waded through the bizarre legal gymnastics of political disqualifications in the Knesset. We analyzed the explosive 2023 judicial reforms, the terrifying historical parallels to the Weimar Republic, and the deep systemic rot of unchecked institutional power.
We basically looked at an engine of state that has been completely torn apart.
It forces you to realize how fragile the concept of sovereignty really is. The rules that govern a nation are only as strong as the consensus that holds them together.
Absolutely.
And I want to speak directly to you, the listener, as we wrap this up. Whether you are listening from a parliamentary system, a republic, or a constitutional monarchy, it is terrifyingly easy to assume the mechanics of your government are permanent.
You assume the engine will just keep humming.
But when you look at the anatomy of a systemic breakdown, like the one detailed in this source material, you realize that every balance of power is a choice. Every legal doctrine is a pendulum. And when one institution accumulates too much power, the eventual correction can tear the whole system apart.
And building on everything we have unpacked today, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to explore on your own.
Let's hear it.
We have spent this deep dive rigorously examining the severe dangers of an unelected court assuming absolute power over the military and the legislature. The documentary makes a devastating case against judicial.
It really does.
But consider the inverse reality of our modern world. In an era defined by rapid technological disruption, global crises, and the explosive rise of volatile, hyperpolarized populations, if we completely strip our courts of their veto power and we hand absolute, unchecked authority to the emotionally driven, fluctuating whims of elected politicians.
Are we actually solving the problem?
Exactly. Are we actually solving the problem? Or are we simply trading a judicial tyranny for a majoritarian one? When the political pendulum swings violently against you, where does the true safety of the minority actually lie?
That is the ultimate question every modern democracy is currently bleeding over.
Imagine, if you will, a lifelong, absolutely devoted, die-hard fan of a sports team.
Right, like a super fan.
Exactly, yeah. And I'm not just talking about someone who, buys a jersey every couple of years. I mean, someone whose entire identity, their family history, their whole social circle, it's all completely wrapped up in the colors of this one specific franchise.
Okay, I'm picturing.
Now, imagine this superfan suddenly gets promoted. Like, they work their way up the ranks and become the head referee of the entire...
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right. And in the the final deciding moments of the absolute biggest championship game of the century, what does this referee do?
I feel like I know where this is going.
They blow the whistle, they pull out a red card, and they completely disqualify their own beloved team's star.
That's wild.
Just takes them right off the field.
It completely upends everything you think you know about human loyalty, doesn't it?
Exactly. And the immediate question everyone in the stadium is asking is, how does something like that actually happen?
Right. Like, did they just suddenly become completely objective?
Yeah. Did the referee suddenly see the light of pure, objective fairness? Did they shed decades of bias in an instant? Or, and this is the much darker question, were they quietly pressured by the league's front office to make that specific call?
That's the real mystery.
It is. And that exact scenario, a referee taking out his own star player, it isn't sports. It is the exact accusation being leveled at the highest legal office in Israel in a documentary we are decoding.
And it is a fascinating piece of media to decode, honestly, because it touches on the ultimate paradox of institutional power.
Yeah, absolutely.
When a person's entire history points aggressively in one direction, but their actions at the absolute pinnacle of their career point in the exact opposite direction.
Right, you have to wonder what happened.
Exactly. We have to ask what happened in the gap between those two realities.
And that is exactly what we are exploring today. We are taking a deep dive into an incredibly intense, highly specific media narrative. The source material is a YouTube documentary video titled The Jurist's Rebellion, Episode 3. And this specific text, it focuses its lens squarely on one man, Avichai Mandelblit. He is the former Attorney General.
A huge figure.
But before we get into it, I want to establish some ground rules for you, the listener, right out of the gate.
Very important to do that.
Yeah, our mission today is not to take a political side. We aren't here to tell you who the good guys or the bad guys are in his politics.
Which is obviously an incredibly charged, complex subject.
Oh, extremely. We are here as entirely neutral observers.
That is a crucial distinction for us to maintain. We are treating this video documentary as an artifact.
Right.
A text to be analyzed. We are looking at how it built its case.
Exactly. Our goal is to unpack how this specific source constructs its argument about power, about justice, and, about what happens when an individual clashes with massively entrenched bureaucratic.
The architecture of an argument.
Yes, the architecture. And to really understand how this documentary builds its foundation, we actually have to start near the end of the timeline.
Right. We have to jump forward.
The video insists that to understand the whole story, we have to look at a very specific date, November 25th, 2019.
November 21st, 2019. It is essentially the earthquake.
Yeah.
Everything else the documentary discusses is an attempt to explain the tectonic shift that led to this single tremor.
So what happens on that day?
On this day, Avichai Mandelblit, who is serving as Israel's Attorney General, he steps up to the podium and makes a historic, entirely unprecedented announcement.
Completely unprecedented.
He announces the criminal indictment of the sitting Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, on 3 severe charges.
An attorney general indicting the active head of state, that alone is a generation.
It really freezes a country in its tracks.
It does. But the documentary, it doesn't just focus on the legal weight of the moment, right? They zero in on the emotional framing Mandelblit used.
They do. The source specifically highlights the exact phrasing Mandelblit chose to use during this broadcast.
Right. What did he say?
He stood before the cameras and said he was making this monumental decision, quote, with a heavy heart, but a whole heart.
With a heavy heart, but a whole heart. It's poetic, honestly.
It is.
It suggests a man burdened by duty, but completely resolute in his conviction. It's like the kind of quote you expect to see chiseled into a courthouse wall.
Yeah, exactly. But the documentary isn't admiring his rhetoric here.
No, not at all.
They are using it to highlight a massive, jarring contradiction based on who Mandelblit was before he walked up to that microphone.
Exactly. The narrative immediately pivots to his biography because according to the argument they are constructing, his background makes this specific indictment seem almost mathematically impossible.
Right. The source points out that Mandelblit was a Beitar youth.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't deeply versed in Israeli political history, what does it actually mean to be a Beitar youth?
Well, the Beitar movement is a revisionist Zionist youth.
Okay.
Historically, it is deeply, inextricably aligned with the political right in Israel.
Got it.
It's not just a casual affiliation, It's an ideological foundation.
Right. It's his root.
Exact. But the documentary goes further. They emphasize that he is the son of a commander in the Irgun.
The Irgun. And that being the right-wing paramilitary group that operated before the State of Israel was even founded. Right?
Correct. So you have a family legacy rooted in the militant foundational right wing of the country. Furthermore, the source notes he was a former Likud actor.
And Likud, of course, is Benjamin Netanyahu's own political party.
Exact. The video paints a picture of a man who wasn't just a passive conservative. He was, as they frame it, previously seen as a darling of Benjamin Netanyahu himself.
Wow, okay.
He was the ultimate insider's insider in that specific political camp.
Let's just pause and hold that up to the light for a second, because that's wild.
It is.
The documentary is deliberately stacking these biographic tales. Son of an Irgun commander, Beitar youth, Likud activist, Netanyahu's darling.
Right, it's a very specific resume.
How does a man with that specific resume become the architect of Benjamin Netanyahu's potential downfall?
That's the million-dollar question.
The source is using these facts to pose a very binary, deeply provocative question to the viewer.
The central thesis posed right at the beginning of their narrative. Did this man undergo a genuine, profound, ideological transformation?
Like a true road to Damascus moment where he saw the object of the law.
Exact. Or, and this is the alternative, does the legal system possess a built-in systemic mechanism for straightening people out?
Straightening them out.
Yeah, so that they fit the institution's own agenda, regardless of their personal history.
And this is the concept I really want to wrestle with, because it challenges a very core assumption we tend to have about
it. Does.
Usually when a society appoints a new leader, like a CEO, a police chief, a top prosecutor, we operate on this heroic narrative that the individual is going to shape the institution.
Right, the maverick coming in to fix things.
Yeah, we think, oh, they're going to go in there and clean house. They're going to bend the bureaucracy to their will.
But this documentary is arguing the exact opposite.
The exact opposite. They are suggesting that the institution swallows the leader.
It's a terrifying premise if you believe in individual agency, honestly.
Yeah, it really is.
The documentary is essentially arguing that the system is a machine, and you are just a cog.
Just a cog.
It doesn't matter what shape you are when you enter the machine will grind you down until you fit perfectly into its gears.
I think we've all experienced a micro version of this, you know?
Oh, for sure.
Think about joining a massive corporation. You walk in on day one thinking, I'm going to change the culture here. I'm going to cut through the red tape.
Oh, yeah, all that optimism.
And then, like, 3 years later, you realize you're speaking entirely in corporate jargon. You're scheduling meetings about meetings.
Right.
The culture has completely rewritten you.
It happens so fast.
It does. And the documentary is alleging that this exact dynamic happens at the absolute highest levels of sovereign government.
And to prove this structural phenomenon, to explain precisely why they believe Mandelblit was uniquely, tragically vulnerable to this kind of institutional straightening,
right,
the narrative forces us to travel back in time.
Okay, where are we going?
We have to rewind to a period long before he was the Attorney General, to a time when he found himself sitting on the very opposite side of the interrogation table.
Wow, okay. This brings us to what the source portrays as the defining crucible of his entire career, a saga known as the Harpaz affair.
The Harpaz affair.
And we really need to spend some time here because this isn't just a story about, like, a disagreement over tax policy.
No, not at all.
According to the documentary, this is a full-blown espionage-level drama taking place inside the military establishment.
It's incredibly complex.
So to set the scene, before Mandelblit was the Attorney General, he was the Chief Military Advocate General.
Yes. The Chief Military Advocate General is essentially the top legal authority for the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF.
Okay.
It is a position of immense power and prestige.
Right. You are the ultimate arbiter of military law. But then, while holding this office, Mandelblit suddenly finds himself being investigated as a criminal suspect. I mean, how does the top lawyer become the target?
Well, the source describes the Harpaz affair as one of the most convoluted, bizarre, and destructive scandals in modern Israeli public life.
Okay.
To break down the mechanics exactly as detailed in the video, the catalyst was a man named Boaz Harpaz.
Right, Boaz Harpaz. Who is he?
He was described as an individual connected to special military operations.
Okay, like intel stuff.
Yeah, and according to the source, Harpaz was closely linked to the IDF chief of staff at the time, a man named Gabi Ashkenaz.
And just to be clear for the listener, the chief of staff is the highest-ranking officer in the military.
Correct. Now, at this same time, the documentary outlines a massive, bitter power struggle occurring.
Between who?
Between Chief of Staff Ashkenazi and his civilian boss, the defense minister, Aharon Barak.
Oh, wow.
It was a clash of titans over the future of the military and the succession of leadership.
It sounds like something out of a Roman history book. The generals fighting the politicians for control.
Exactly. And in the middle of this intense bureaucratic warfare, a forged document was leaked to the press.
A forged document, okay.
The purpose of this fabricated document, as the source explains it, was highly specific.
What was it supposed to do?
It was designed to thwart the appointment of a general named Yoav Gallant, who was slated to be the next chief of staff.
Okay, so it was a dirty trick.
Yes. A piece of manufactured disinformation meant to manipulate the highest echelons of military succession.
Okay, so there's a forged document flying around, generals are fighting ministers, and it's a massive scandal. Where does Mandelblit, the military's top lawyer, fit into this mess?
Right. It seems disconnected at first.
The documentary surely isn't claiming he sat in a dark room and forged the document himself, right?
No, the force doesn't claim he forged anything, but they allege something that in a legal context can be just as damaging.
Okay, what is that?
The documentary claims that Mandelblit knew crucial details about what was going on behind the scenes and actively chose not to act.
Oh.
The video uses a highly specific, very loaded term to describe his behavior. They claim he operated almost as a consigliere.
A consigliere, wow. That is an incredibly heavy word.
It really is.
You hear consigliere and you immediately think of, like, The Godfather.
Exactly.
You think of the mob lawyer whose job isn't to uphold the law, but to fix problems for the boss, to make things disappear. Yeah. Applying that word to a military prosecutor is a massive act.
It is a deliberate and damning framing by the source.
Yeah.
They are arguing that instead of representing the military as an objective institution, and instead of upholding the law without prejudice, Mandelblit functioned as a personal loyalist legal counselor.
For the chief of staff.
Right, for Chief of Staff Ashkenazi,
yeah.
in what was essentially a personal, potentially criminal matter.
That's a huge breach.
And because of this alleged complicity, this failure to blow the whistle, the police actually recommended indicting men for obstruction of justice and breach of trust.
I want to pause on breach of trust for a second, because I know from looking at Israeli legal news that this charge comes up a lot.
It does, very frequently.
It seems like a very broad tool. The top lawyer is facing an indictment for essentially covering for his boss.
Yeah.
Now, here is where the documentary takes a really fascinating turn. You would think the source is setting this up to say, look, Mandelblit was always corrupt. He was a criminal mastermind from the start.
Right, that would be the obvious narrative.
But they actually don't say that. In fact, the source claims that Mandelblit was ultimately treated unjustly by the system during this Harpaz investigation.
Yes, the documentary introduces a deep psychological pivot right here.
Okay.
They acknowledge that the justice system came down on him incredibly hard, perhaps disproportionately so.
Okay, but why?
Well, they use this experience of injustice to build a psychological profile. They argue that this ordeal being interrogated, feeling railroaded by an aggressive prosecution,
right,
seeing the complex, perhaps even dirty internal bureaucracy of the justice system from the inside as a vulnerable suspect, this should have been his great awakening.
Oh, I see. Right. If you get chewed up by a broken, unfair system and then you somehow survive and are later put in charge of that very same system, your first instinct should be to grab a sledgehammer. The documentary argues he should have been the guy to walk into the Attorney General's office, bang on the table.
Because he knew exactly where all the bodies were buried.
Yeah, and he knew exactly how the system abused its power.
The narrative suggests that any person with a strong moral compass, upon surviving this trauma, would become a fierce, uncompromising reformer.
But I'm guessing that didn't happen.
According to the source, that is absolutely not what happened.
Let's dig into that psychology because it's so interesting. Why wouldn't someone who was victimized by a system want to fix it?
Great question.
The documentary seems to imply that the system broke his spirit before he even took the top job. It's like being audited by a massive tax authority, right?
A good analogy.
Let's say you get audited and you discover firsthand that their entire system is a chaotic, punitive, irrational mess that nearly ruins your life and your reputation.
It's a nightmare.
But then, like 5 years later, you were miraculously appointed as the head commissioner of that exact same tax authority.
Right.
The logical expectation is that you'd fix the broken audit system that tortured you, but instead you just quietly sign off on more broken audits for other people.
Yeah.
The source is asking the listener to consider the profound psychological damage required to make a person that way.
If we follow the documentary's logic, they are illustrating the invisible, enduring chains of institutional leverage.
Leverage, right.
They are suggesting that a powerful bureaucratic system doesn't necessarily need to explicitly threaten you to control you. If they have already shown you the inside of an interrogation, if they have already made you feel the cold reality of their power to destroy your life, the memory of that vulnerability is often enough to keep you permanently in. The source implies the trauma of the Harpaz affair terrified him into compliance and stripped him of his independent will.
So, according to the narrative, he is traumatized, he is ethically compromised by his past, but he still desperately wants top civilian job, which is attorney.
Yeah, still wants the power.
Which brings us to the actual appointment process. And this is where the documentary transitions from psychological profiling to presenting hard audio.
This is a huge shift in the video.
Yeah, they don't just offer opinions here. They bring out exclusive recordings that paint a very specific backroom picture of how power really operates.
The documentary introduces these recordings to pull back the curtain on the selection process.
Right, which is supposed to be clean, right?
Exactly. It is supposed to be a pristine, objective search for the most qualified jurist in the country.
But it was.
Instead, the source provides audio that allegedly shows Mandelblit actively and aggressively lobbying behind the scenes for his own selection.
Now, I have to play a devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
If you are applying for, a vice president role at a tech company or trying to make partner at a law firm, lobbying for yourself is just called networking.
Right.
You call people, you check in on the votes, you show initiative. Why is the documentary framing this as a smoking gun?
Because of the specific nature of the office.
Okay, how so?
According to the narrative presented in the source, it is entirely against established protocol and borders on the illegal for a candidate for Attorney General to be conducting this kind of covert back-channel lobbying.
With the search committee?
Yes, with the members of the supposedly independent search committee. The video quotes a specific recording where Mandelblit is speaking to a man named Yehiel Katz.
Who is Katz?
He is an active member of this search committee.
And what exactly does Mandelblit say on?
He is heard asking Katz if, quote, Gabriela is closed, referring to securing the vote of another specific committee member.
Okay, and what does Katz?
Katz responds by assuring Mandelblit that the vote is, quote, locked.
Gabriela is closed, the vote is locked. I mean, the terminology alone, it sounds exactly like a scene from a political thriller where they are trading favors in a smoke-filled.
It really does sound like that.
But here's the question that naturally follows. If Mandelblit had all this baggage from the Harpaz, if he was known to have operated as a consigliere, why was the existing legal establishment, the prosecution, so willing to support his appointment?
Right. Why wouldn't they want someone with a clean record?
Exactly. The source makes a fascinating, almost cynical claim about their motive.
The documentary asserts that the justice establishment's support for Mandelblit was not based on his legal brilliance or his unblemished record or his grand vision for justice.
What was?
Rather, it was based entirely on institutional fear.
Fear of what?
Fear of the alternative. The video claims the prosecution establishment was terrified of a rival candidate for the AG position, a man named Shagi Rodkoff.
Okay, why were they scared of him?
They viewed Rodkoff as a genuine reformer, someone who was dangerous to their status quo and who might actually curtail their power.
Oh, I see.
So the narrative goes, they threw their weight behind Mandelblit precisely because they knew he was compromised by his past.
Oh, wow.
They viewed him as the safer, more controllable option.
I want to make sure you, the listener, really absorb the irony the sources point out here because it is staggering.
It's massive.
On the one hand, Mandelblit has seen firsthand from his time as a suspect in the Harpaz affair that the prosecution makes decisions based on what the source calls extraneous considerations.
Right.
He knows they protect their own, they block rivals, they play dirty politics. He knows the system is flawed.
He experienced it personally.
Yet, instead of blowing the whistle on it, he actively uses those exact same dirty, extraneous considerations to get the job.
Yeah, he plays the game.
He leverages the broken system to get the cast.
It highlights a profound structural flaw, which the documentary brings into sharp focus by citing a formal legal warning from the time.
Okay, a warning from who?
They bring up a minority opinion written by former Supreme Court Justice Asher Grunis.
Grunis?
Yeah, Grunis looked at the specific appointment process and saw a glaring, catastrophic conflict of interest.
What was Grunis's argument against?
Grunis argued that Mandelblit had worked far too closely with Prime Minister Netanyahu, having served directly as his cabinet secretary, to suddenly be elevated to the role of the top prosecutor in charge of evaluating criminal evidence against that very same prime minister.
I mean, that makes complete logical sense. It's like hiring the CEO's personal trusted assistant to suddenly become the independent auditor investigating the CEO's personal finances.
Exactly.
It is inherently tangled. You cannot reasonably expect objectivity.
The source uses Grunis's objection to unpack the structural absurdity of the Attorney General position in Israel, which is a uniquely dual role.
Right. Explain that duality.
On one hand, the AG is the chief legal advisor to the government. So that's a position requiring deep personal trust and collaboration with the prime minister.
Oh.
But on the other hand, this exact same official is the head of the criminal prosecution, meaning they are the only person who can authorize an investigation into the government they're advising.
Wow.
Furthermore, The government is often dictated to by the Supreme Court on who they can even hire for this role.
That mess.
Gruda's thought placing Mandelblit in the center of this spiderweb was a recipe for institutional disaster.
But the documentary also acknowledges that there was an opposing viewpoint at the time, right?
Yes, there was.
Not everyone agreed. Some people thought this incredibly tangled, contradictory background actually made him the perfect guy for the job.
Yes, the source mentions the counter-argument that prevailed at the time. The theory was that because Mandelblit had worked intimately with the prime minister as cabinet secretary, and because he had personally been a suspect interrogated by the police in the Harpaz affair.
Right, he's seen it all.
Exactly. He would be a uniquely well-rounded, empathetic figure. The belief was that he would understand all sides of the equation. He would understand the executive branch's need to govern, he would understand the prosecution's mandate, and he would viscerally understand the vulnerability of being a suspect.
Like, he was supposed to be the man who could see the entire board with perfect clarity.
He was billed as the philosopher king of the justice.
The one guy who has seen it from every angle. But, as the documentary tells it, getting the job didn't turn him into a wise, independent king.
No.
Because the ghost of the Harpaz affair, that trauma and vulnerability he experienced as a suspect, followed him right into the Attorney General's office. The past wasn't buried.
Not at all.
Which leads us to some of the most explosive, jaw-dropping material in this entire narrative. The Shai Nitzan.
This specific segment of the documentary is deeply unsettling if you care about the internal integrity of a justice.
Yeah, it's wild.
The source details a massive leak that occurred in October 2020.
Okay.
These were private audio recordings of Mandelblit speaking frankly about the state attorney at the time, a man named Shai Nitzan.
Before we get to the quotes, explain the hierarchy here. Who reports to who?
For context, the state attorney is the head of the state prosecution, but technically, legally, they are subordinate to the Attorney General.
So Mandelblit is the boss.
Yes, Mandelblit is the boss. Nitzan is his employee. But the power dynamic revealed in these tapes, as framed by the source, is entirely inverted.
Right, because the quotes the documentary pulls from these tapes are wild.
They are.
Mandelblit, the supreme law enforcement officer in the country, the boss, is caught on tape saying about his subordinate, quote, "The maniac doesn't decide on my case."
And then he goes further.
He does. He explicitly states that Shai Nitzan has him, quote, by the throat. I want to repeat that. The
documentary uses these recordings to construct a devastating ethical and legal critique.
I mean, how could they not?
The source argues that these tapes are undeniable proof that the Attorney General of Israel felt he was being actively extorted.
Extorted over what, though? Like, what did Nitzan have over him?
The issue stems from the Harpaz affair. Even though Mandelblit became Attorney General, the legal closure of his own past involved the final, formal, written closing of his criminal file had not been officially completed by the prosecutor.
Wait, his file was still open?
Yes. The narrative suggests that Shai Nitzan was intentionally dragging his feet, dangling this unresolved criminal file over his own boss's head as a mechanism of control.
Let's stop and really think about the implication, because it is terrifying.
It really is.
The documentary is asking us to consider a reality where the Attorney General of a sovereign nation feels he is being blackmailed by his own staff.
Right.
If you find yourself in that position, what are your options? The source argues there are really only two moral choices available.
Okay, what are they?
One, you resign immediately, citing the fact that you are hopelessly compromised and cannot perform your duties objectively.
That's the honorable thing.
Or two, you call a massive press conference, you play the tapes yourself, and you blow the whistle on the extortion to the public so you can be free of the pressure.
Precisely.
Yeah.
If we follow the source's logic, radical transparency or immediate resignation are the only ethical exits from that kind of trap.
Right.
But the documentary points out that Mandelblit did neither.
Neither of them.
Therefore, the source concludes that he chose to allow what they call extraneous personal consideration, namely his own legal survival into the holy of holies of the justice system.
Wow.
By staying silent and submitting to the leverage, he traded his professional independence for personal safety, thereby destroying public trust.
Now, I do want to make sure we are presenting the full picture here, because the documentary does mention that there is a defense to this, right?
They do, yes.
It wasn't just a completely one-sided hit piece. Yeah. They do acknowledge how Mandelblit's defenders explain this tape away.
Yes. The defense offered, which the source includes for context, is that this was a highly private, informal venting session with a colleague named Ifi Nava.
Okay, just venting.
The core of the defense is that this conversation should never have been recorded, let alone broadcast on national television.
Sure.
Furthermore, the argument is that human beings often use hyperbolic, dramatic language in private that they do not mean literally.
Like blowing off steam.
Exactly. Under this defense, saying someone has you by the throat might just be a dramatic, frustrated way of saying, My subordinate is really annoying me with this bureaucratic paperwork delay.
I hear that defense. We all vent about our coworkers, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
We've all gone to a friend and said, oh my God, my boss is killing me today. But the documentary clearly isn't buying it was just harmless venting.
No, they are not.
And honestly, looking at the context, it makes me think deeply about how leverage operates in everyday life, not just in government. Think about any job you've ever had. Let's say you owe your direct manager a massive personal favor. Like maybe they covered for you when you made a mistake that should have gotten you fired.
Okay, yeah.
If you are in a meeting a month later and that manager proposes a terrible, highly destructive idea, can you ever really push back?
Probably not.
You are going to sit there quietly because they hold leverage over your life.
That makes total sense.
Now, the source is asking us to take that everyday, relatable human dynamic and multiply it by the highest legal office in the land, where the stakes aren't office supplies, but the liberty of citizens and the stability of the entire government.
That is a profound extrapolation of the source's argument. Institutional leverage rarely needs to be articulated out loud to be effective.
Right, it's just understood.
The documentary isn't necessarily claiming that Shai Nitzan walked into Mandelblit's office and explicitly said, indict the prime minister, or I reopen your criminal case.
Like a cartoon villain.
Right. They are implying that the feeling of being held by the throat, the mere existence of the unresolved file, dictates behavior just as effectively as overt black.
And the documentary argues that this exact dynamic, this systemic weakness, this feeling of being permanently compromised is the only way to explain what happened next.
Because what happens next is huge.
We are moving from the internal office politics of the Justice Department to the main event, the event that altered the course of
The Netanyahu investigation.
Yes, which the source refers to as the 1000.
Yes, starting in roughly 2016, the system began a series of massive investigations into Prime Minister Netanyahu, referred to as Case 1000, Case 2000, and Case 4.
And this is where the documentary drops what they considered to be a massive procedural bombshell regarding how these investigations were initiated.
A huge procedural.
I want to get the mechanics of this exactly right, because the documentary hinges heavily on this point. What is the central claim the source makes about how these specific investigations into the prime minister were handled?
Okay, so according to Israeli law, as explained in the narrative, initiating a criminal investigation against a sitting prime minister is not something local police could just decide.
Right. It shouldn't be easy.
It requires the explicit, formal, written authorization of the Attorney General.
Written authorization?
Yeah. It is designed to be a rigorously documented, highly scrutinized decision to prevent political witch hunts. However, the source reveals that the police began these massive, sprawling investigations based only on oral approval from Mandelblit.
Oral approval? Are you kidding?
That's what the source claimed.
You need written approval from HR just to expense a business lunch or change your desk chair in most corporate offices.
True.
But you can launch a criminal probe into a head of state based on a verbal nod. Why is written approval so vital?
Well, written approval creates a concrete timeline. It defines the exact scope of the investigation, and it creates legal accountability.
Right, boundary.
An oral approval is a ghost. It allows an investigation to expand infinitely without clear boundaries or a paper trail of who authorized what.
And the documentary has a problem with that.
The documentary finds this lack of documentation not just sloppy, but fundamentally illegitimate.
Did it lead to actual issues in court?
They note that a senior police investigator later had to admit under oath in court that many aggressive investigative actions, including interrogations and document seizures, were taken without the Attorney General's formal, documented approval.
The narrative paints a picture of a police force and a prosecution operating completely
unchecked.
But wait, didn't Mandelblit try to set boundaries? The documentary mentions a specific protocol from a meeting in July 2016. What happened there?
Yes. The video highlights a detail from that July 2016 protocol to show that Mandelblit did initially try to assert some control.
Okay.
During this meeting, Mandelblit explicitly instructed the investigators to only check, quote, where there is meat.
Meaning what exactly? Like solid evidence?
Meaning, investigate specific, credible allegations that have substantive evidence. Do not go on open-ended, boundless fishing expeditions hoping to accidentally uncover a crime.
Right, don't just dig until you find something.
However, the source claims that the police completely ignored this directive.
Just ignored the boss.
The documentary argues they went rogue, constantly expanding the scope of the probe with the tacit protective support of State Attorney Shai Nitzan.
Okay, here is where I have to push back logically on the story the documentary is telling.
Go ahead.
If I am the Attorney General and the police completely ignore my direct, explicit orders to only investigate where there is meat,
Yeah.
if they go rogue, ignore the boundaries, and bypass the requirement for written consent to build a case, why on earth do I then sign my name to the final indictment?
It's a huge contradiction.
Right. If my team disobeys me to gather evidence illegally or improperly, I throw the case out and I fire them. How do you sign an indictment if your own foundational rules for the investigation were violated?
That glaring contradiction is exactly what the source wants the listener to dwell on.
Oh, okay. So how do they...
To answer your question, the documentary characterizes Mandelblit in this era as a complete rubber stamp.
A rubber stamp?
Despite holding the supreme title and the ultimate legal authority, he is portrayed not as a leader guiding a process, but as a captive who was relentlessly led, bullied, and manipulated by a monolithic and aggressive process.
So Nitzan is really running the show.
The source points specifically to Shai Nitzan as the true puppet master, orchestrating these events from below, using that unresolved Harpaz file as leverage to ensure Mandelblit kept stamping the approval.
So the documentary is basically saying the inmates were running the asylum, and the warden was too scared to stop them, so he just kept stamping their hall pass.
That's a very apt analogy.
But it's not just fear from below, right? The documentary also throws another completely different motive in. They allege someone else was pulling strings.
Yes, the narrative introduces another major figure, Aharon Barak.
Who is that?
Barak is a former president of the Supreme Court and is widely considered the architect of Israel's modern judicial activist movement. He is a titan of the legal establishment.
Okay.
The source alleges that Aharon Barak knew Mandelblit harbored a deep, desperate ambition to eventually be appointed to the Supreme Court himself.
The ultimate prize for a jurist.
Exactly. The implication the documentary makes here is that this immense personal ambition was weaponized against.
Oh.
The narrative suggests that the legal establishment silently, perhaps implicitly, communicated to men, if you ever want to see it on the Supreme Court, you have to play ball.
You have to prove you're one of us.
Exactly. And playing ball in this specific historical moment means indicting Prime Minister Netanyahu.
So let's look at the portrait the documentary has painted. On one side, looking down, he's terrified of his subordinate Shai Nitzan reopening his old criminal file and destroying his current life.
Right.
On the other side, looking up, he's desperate for the approval of Aharon Barak and the establishment to get his dream job on the court.
Fear from below, ambition from above.
Fear and ambition. The source is portraying a man completely trapped in a vice of his own making. They are arguing that the pattern of institutional weakness, which started with a failure to speak up in the Harpaz affair, metastasized how he handled the political fate of the prime.
It is a devastating, multi-layered character study as presented by the source. But the creators of this documentary understand something crucial about perspective. They know that a 40-minute lecture about protocols, oral approvals, Supreme Court ambitions, and high-level political indictment can start to feel very abstract and distant to the average citizen.
It can definitely get dry.
To truly drive their thesis home, to make the listener feel the danger of this unchecked power, they shift the focus entirely.
Where do they?
They move away from the Prime Minister and focus on a deeply personal, almost terrifying anecdote involving an average person on the street.
And this brings us to the part of the documentary that honestly made my jaw drop.
It's quite the story.
We are talking about the incident the video refers to as the Shabbat. Walk us through exactly what the source claims happened here.
The documentary introduces us to a woman who happens to live in the same neighborhood as Attorney General Mandelblit.
Okay.
She is described by the source as a young, religious mother of 5 children who also works as a lawyer.
Got it.
The incident in question takes place on a Saturday morning. In the Jewish tradition, this is Shabbat, the day of rest.
And just to provide context for listeners who might not be familiar, Shabbat in a religious neighborhood is a very distinct environment.
Yes, it is. It is a time characterized by quiet, by prayer, and by a strict absence of everyday commerce or machinery.
Right.
In deeply observant neighborhoods, people do not drive cars, they do not use phones. It is a sacred, legally, and culturally protected period of tranquility.
Okay, so the scene is set. It's a quiet Saturday morning. What happened?
According to the source, this woman is walking to the synagogue. In fact, she is walking to the very same synagogue where both Mandelblit and her own father-in-law happen to pray.
Okay.
As she is walking down the street, she crosses paths with the Attorney General. And as she walks past him, she says exactly 3 words.
What did she say?
She says, quote, Parashat Mishpatim Busha.
3 words. Parashat Mishpatim. For those of us who aren't fluent in Hebrew or Torah study, what does that translate to, and what is the cultural weight behind it?
It translates roughly to the Torah portion of Mishpatim is a shame.
Okay.
Mishpatim is a specific section of the Torah that deals extensively with laws, the administration of justice, and the righteous, uncorrupted behavior required of judges.
Oh, I see.
By saying Mishpatim Busha, she was essentially using a very specific, religiously coded intellectual phrase to say to him, your version of justice is a shame.
Okay.
It was a brief, cutting verbal protest delivered in passing.
Okay, it's a sharp insult, it's pointed, but we live in democracies, you know? Politicians, judges, and public figures get insulted on the street every single day.
They absolutely do.
People yell far worse things at mayors and governors all the time. So she says her 3 words. What happens next, according to the video?
The source claims that Mandelblit's reaction was immediate and extreme.
What did he do?
He signaled his security detail. Within minutes, police cruisers, meaning vehicles operating and disrupting the quiet of the Sabbath, arrived in this strictly observant neighborhood.
Wow.
The police detained this young mother on the street when she, being a lawyer, asked what exactly was happening and on what grounds she was being held. The police allegedly threatened to put her in physical handcuffs right there on the sidewalk if she didn't comply immediately.
Over 3 words spoken in passing.
Yes. They then arrested her in front of her young children on Shabbat on suspicion of harassment.
They pulled a mother into a squad car on the Sabbath in front of her kids because she criticized the Attorney General's sense of justice.
Yes.
That is honestly, it sounds like something out of an authoritarian state, not a modern democracy.
And the narrative gets even darker when she is taken to the precinct.
Oh, it gets worse.
The source claims that while she was being questioned at the police station, the interrogating officer actually said to her, quote,
"You touched an exposed nerve."
"You touched an exposed nerve." Let's analyze that phrase, because what a chilling thing for an agent of the state to admit out loud.
It's very revealing.
If the police arrest you for a crime, they should say, "You violated statute 402.
Exactly.
By saying you touched an exposed nerve, the investigator is tacitly admitting that the law isn't being applied objectively.
Right.
It's admitting that the immense coercive power of the state is being deployed as a personal weapon simply because a powerful man got his feelings hurt and lashed out.
It strips away the illusion of blind justice.
And the documentary notes that this abuse of power didn't just end at the police station that morning, right? The legal system kept fighting her long after the initial anger should have faded.
Yes, the aftermath is just as telling. The woman eventually sought legal recourse. She sued over this deeply traumatic, arguably illegal arrest.
Makes sense. But the documentary points out that the state prosecution, the massive legal apparatus working under Mandelblit, fought fiercely, using endless state resources to prevent the Attorney General from ever having to testify about the incident in court. The system threw a massive protective wall around him to shield him from accountability for his personal overreaction.
So why does the documentary spend so much crucial screen time on this one localized neighborhood?
It's a key transition.
Right. They just spent an hour talking about prime ministers and Supreme Court justices. Why pivot to a mother on a sidewalk? Because they're making a massive, sweeping philosophical point here.
Absolutely.
They are moving the critique from the abstract, like whether an indictment was signed with a pen or approved verbally, to the visceral flesh and blood impact of unchecked power on everyday citizens.
That is the exact analytical pivot the source is making. The documentary is using this specific anecdote to prove their core thesis, that the legal system has become draconian, destructive, and entirely uncaring about human rights whenever its own power, prestige, or ego is challenged, even in the slightest, most mundane way.
Right.
The narrative argues that this system is perfectly willing to traumatize average citizens and violate cultural norms to protect the fragile egos of its own elite.
The hypocrisy highlighted by the source here is just blinding. Think about it.
It really is.
The legal system, and specifically the Attorney General's office, prides itself on being the ultimate enlightened defender of universal human rights.
They are supposed to be the shield.
They're the ones who write the briefs about protecting the little guy from the overreach of the state. But the documentary is showing us a scenario where the second the AG feels personally insulted, all those grand theories of human rights vanish, and a mother is thrown in a squad car on a Saturday morning.
Which forces you, the listener, to speculate on the broader systemic implication. What does it actually mean for the health of a society when the very institution designed to uphold rights weaponizes its monopoly on violence over a polite, 3-word religious insult?
It's a scary thought.
I would argue, and the source implies, that it reveals a profound fragility beneath the immense power. A system that is confident in its pursuit of objective justice does not arrest women for speaking on the sidewalk.
Right.
If the system is that sensitive, it is acting out of a paranoid need for
absolute submission. That concept that the system demands submission above all else is the perfect transition to the final overarching theme of the source.
The big picture.
Yes. The documentary calls this entire phenomenon the jurist's rebellion, which is a very provocative title. They use a quote from a figure named Tali Gottlieb to crystallize what this rebellion actually looks like. What is her summary?
The source quotes Tali Gottlieb summarizing the terrifying, quiet efficiency of this alleged bureaucratic coup.
Okay, what does she say?
She states that if any elected official, a prime minister, a minister, a legislator, attempts to push for, quote, judicial reform.
Meaning any attempt by the Democratic elected branch's government to limit or balance the power of the unelected legal establishment.
Exactly. If a politician tries to change the rules of the game, Gottlieb argues that the Attorney General doesn't need to debate them in the public square.
No debate.
The AG doesn't need to win an election or convince the voters. The AG simply has an indictment printed against that disobedient politician on a standard piece of A4 paper.
Wow. Just a piece of...
That single piece of paper, stamped by the prosecution, is enough to immediately thwart them, destroy their political career, and maintain the legal system's absolute supremacy.
Let's really unpack the terrifying banality of that image, an A4 paper.
It's very bureaucratic.
The documentary is arguing that the ultimate veto power in the country isn't held by the millions of voters at the ballot box, and it isn't held by the parliament. It's held by the printer in the Attorney General's office. If you, as an elected official, try to change the power structure, they don't argue with you. They just legally disqualify you.
And that is why the source frames this as a jurist's rebellion. But they are careful to clarify that this isn't an armed conflict.
Right. There are no tanks in the street.
There are no generals seizing radios. According to the narrative, it is a bureaucratic paper coup where unelected officials use complex, seemingly legitimate legal mechanisms to consistently override democratic elections.
But the documentary doesn't just spend its entire runtime complaining about the problem, do they? They do actually mention proposed...
They do, yes.
If the system is this broken, what is the structural fix they suggest?
The documentary points out that the role of the Israeli Attorney General, as currently constructed, is practically unique globally.
Okay, why?
Because it consolidates an extreme, contradictory amount of power into one office. The proposed solution mentioned in the source is to institute a structural split. They argue it is absolutely necessary to separate the role of criminal prosecution from the role of providing legal counsel to the government.
Right. You split the job in two. One person is the government's lawyer, helping them write law. A completely different independent person is the head prosecutor.
Exactly. They argue this split is the only way to maintain true independence and prevent the kind of extortion, conflict of interest, and rubber stamping that, according to the documentary, defined Mandelblit's tenure.
And speaking of Mandelblit, what is the source's final verdict on the protagonist of Incredibly Dark?
Pretty grim.
Does he get a redemption arc in this narrative? Does the documentary view him as a tragic hero who did his best in an impossible?
There is no redemption arc offered. The source's final assessment incredibly harsh and uncompromising.
Okay.
They conclude that he left absolutely no positive legacy behind. The narrative ultimately portrays him as a man who faced a moral crossroads and actively chose the, quote, warm, pampering path of swimming.
The warm, pampering path.
He chose the comfort of pleasing the establishment rather than paying the heavy, painful, personal price of standing up and fighting the system's internal rot.
It is the ultimate tragedy of a highly capable man who surrenders his conscience to institutional presence. I want to ask you to weigh in on this based on the source's frame. Throughout this deep dive, we have been circling this classic man versus...
We have?
The documentary itself states at one point, it's both the man and the... What do they mean by that? Because if the system is as totally corrupt and all-powerful as they claim, how can you deeply blame the man for getting crushed?
The source unpacks that exact philosophical tension. Their argument is that while a system can be deeply flawed, terrifying, or even corrupt, an individual with dignity and moral courage is still obligated to fight it.
Or at least not play along.
Or at the very least, refuse to participate in its abuse by choosing not to fight, by choosing to lobby for the job, by choosing to submit to Shai Nitzan's leverage, by choosing to become the rubber stamp for questionable investigations out of fear or ambition.
Yeah.
Mandelblit ceased to be a mere victim of the system. He became the system.
He became the system.
His specific failure of character allowed the institutional rot to metastasize into a full-blown crisis of national democracy.
He was the cog that allowed the machine to keep grinding, and the documentary leaves the viewer with an incredibly evocative, lingering final thought about the nature of that.
They point out that Mandelblit's term ended. He is gone.
Right.
But the true power remains entirely intact. The law enforcement system still dictates the boundaries to elected officials, and they end the video with this quote: "When a closed room is shut for too long, eventually it stinks." It's a powerful, visceral metaphor for the dangers of a lack of transparency and unchecked authority. A room without ventilation, where the occupants only answer to each other, where there's no outside sunlight or fresh air of public accountability, will inevitably breed corruption and decay.
Let's take a breath and briefly recap the incredible journey this deep dive has taken us on today.
Smells good.
We started with the surprising, contradictory origins of Avichai Mandelblit, the right-wing establishment insider who ultimately indicted his own political patron.
The paradox.
We trace the documentary's narrative through the agonizing compromises and the trauma of the Harpaz affair. We looked at the questionable back-channel lobbying for his appointment and the explosive recordings where the top lawyer in the country claimed to be held by the throat by his own subordinates.
Just unbelievable.
We unpacked the complex allegations that he acted as a weak rubber stamp, massive political bypassing, and we examined the deeply disturbing story of a mother arrested on Shabbat for a 3-word, all of which paints a picture of an unchecked, paranoid, primarily concerned with protecting.
It is a dense, intricate, and deeply challenging narrative to process. But I think it is important to ask, why should you, the listener, care about, especially if you have no personal stake or interest in Israeli politics?
That's a great point. Why should they?
You should care, because this source material serves as a masterclass in how institutional power operates anywhere in the world.
Anywhere.
It shows us, step by step, how leverage is maintained in massive bureaucracy. It illustrates how fear and ambition can compromise leadership at the highest levels, and how individuals, with perhaps the best of intention, can be entirely consumed by the very machines they are appointed to control.
I completely agree. It's about the universal mechanics of power. If you understand how this specific documentary dissects the Justice Department, you can look at any major institution in your own life, a massive multinational corporation, a university administrator, a local government agency with a much sharper, more critical eye regarding how decisions are actually made behind.
And that brings me to a final lingering thought I want to leave you with.
Okay, let's hear it.
It's something that isn't explicitly debated in the source material, but it builds directly upon the claims they are making. We spent this time exploring the documentary's argument that this specific legal system is deeply biased, manipulative, and engaged in a bureaucratic rebellion against elected officials.
Right.
But consider this broader implication. In a functioning modern democracy, does it even matter if the justice system is actually objectively corrupt? Or is the mere widespread perception of corruption enough to break a country apart?
Oh, wow.
If half the public looks at the referee on the field and genuinely, truly believes he has been bought by the front office,
Yeah.
does the game even exist anymore?
Wow. If the players and the fans don't believe the whistle is fair, the sport is no longer a game, it just devolves into a brawl. That is a heavy, essential thought to mull over.
Imagine finding out that your top prosecutor, right, like a massive figure in your district, is caught taking a $150,000 bribe from a mafia syndicate.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's huge.
Right. You would naturally expect a massive FBI-style purge.
Yeah.
You'd expect the head of the agency to launch an immediate scorched earth internal investigation to find out exactly how deep the rot goes.
Absolutely. You'd want to amputate that immediately.
Exactly. But instead, the guy who uncovers the corruption, the investigator trying to stop the leak, he gets a furious phone call from his boss.
Wait, furious?
Yeah, completely furious. The investigator gets screamed at, entirely berated, and is ultimately forced to apologize to the corrupt prosecutor.
That's just wild.
It is. And today, we are looking at a documentary that asks a terrifying question for you, the listener, to ponder. What happens when a justice system decides it is entirely above the law it's supposed to?
It is a phenomenal hook into what is arguably one of the most complex institutional critiques we've ever examined.
Yeah, it really flips the script on how we view these things.
It completely inverts our standard understanding of law and order because, we generally assume the justice system acts as a neutral arbiter, like a mechanism designed to catch bad actors.
Right, the good guys catching the bad guys.
Exactly. But the text we are exploring today posits a scenario where the system itself becomes the primary bad actor.
So they're using the tools of justice not to protect the public, but to protect their own power.
Precisely. They're utilizing those tools to protect their own absolute power.
And that brings us to the specific mission of today's deep dive. We are unpacking a highly provocative, intensely charged piece of media today.
Very charged.
It's an excerpt from a documentary series broadcast on the Israeli channel C14. It's specifically titled The Jurists' Rebellion, Episode 4. Did Shai Nitzan serve the public or build himself a kingdom?
Quite a title.
Yeah, they don't hold back. And for those unfamiliar, Shai Nitzan is the former state attorney of Israel. And the central thesis of this video is that during his tenure, his office basically morphed from a vital public service into an untouchable, self-preserving monarchy operating with zero oversight.
But, before we really delve into the anatomy of this, we absolutely have to establish the framework for our analysis today.
Good point. Ground rules are important here.
Yeah, because this source material presents a fierce, uncompromising, heavily right-wing critique of the Israeli judicial.
It's definitely coming from a specific ideological place.
It is. And it's vital to state up front that our role here is not to take sides or endorse these viewpoints or even validate the political stances driving them.
We're basically acting as structural engineers examining a building, right?
That's a great way to put it. Our job is just to deconstruct how the filmmakers construct their argument. We want to see how they weave their claims and how they utilize specific narratives to build this overarching indictment of Shai Nitzan.
I really appreciate that framing. We're looking at the architecture of the argument because, even if you don't live in Israel, and even if Shai Nitzan is a name you are hearing for the very first time today, the themes present in this documentary excerpt are universal.
Oh, completely universal.
It's like a masterclass in the rhetoric of anti-institutionalism. It touches on that universal friction between unchecked bureaucratic power and the public's desperate demand for accountability.
Yes, the tension there is palpable.
So let's look at how the filmmakers start laying their brick. I mean, how do you go about accusing a career public servant of becoming a literal king?
Well, the documentary begins by aggressively attacking the concept of the neutral bureaucrat. To understand their portrayal of Nitzan, the filmmakers insist we have to look at his origins within the legal ecosystem.
Right, where he came from.
Exactly. They use footage from December 16th, 2013. That was the day he officially took office as state attorney.
So standard swearing-in ceremony stuff.
Yeah, in the clip, he's delivering these standard solemn remarks about understanding the heavy response, the kind of boring procedural footage you see in any democracy.
Nothing out of the ordinary on the surface.
Right. But the documentary immediately subverts that visual by overlaying this intense narrative of entrenched elitism.
Because they refuse to frame him as just a guy who got a promotion, right? Like, they frame him as the product of a highly controlled, decades-long manufacturing process.
Yes, an assembly line for power.
They dive straight into his resume.
Yeah.
They point out that he was an intern for Aharon Barak, the former Supreme Court president, and then an assistant to Dort Beinish, who succeeded Barak.
Those are two massive names in this context.
Right. So for the listener who doesn't follow Israeli legal history, why is that specific lineage so critical to the documentary's argument?
That lineage is the absolute bedrock of the entire critique. Aharon Barak is arguably the most consequential figure in modernism. He championed a philosophy often referred to as the constitutional revolution or judicial act.
Okay.
This massively expanded the court's power to intervene in government and military. Now, to his supporters, he is a hero of human rights.
Right. And to his critics.
To his critics, including the creators of this documentary, he is the architect of a juristocracy.
A juristocracy?
Yeah, a system where unelected judges essentially hold supreme power over elected officials. So by tracing Nitzan's career directly back to Barak and then to Beinish, the filmmakers are telling the audience something specific.
That Nitzan isn't an independent actor.
Exactly. He is the latest heir to an ideological throne.
I was really struck by the language they use there. They explicitly lean into royal imagery. They describe this legal orbit as a monarchy, where the crown is passed down by inheritance.
It's very vivid phrasing.
It is. But I want to push back on the mechanism. Are the filmmakers arguing this is like a grand, smoke-filled room conspiracy to control the country?
That's a fair question.
Or are they just describing the natural, albeit extreme, byproduct of any highly specialized institution that only promotes from within? Because, any corporate board or elite university tends to clone its own leadership.
It's a crucial distinction, and the documentary leans heavily toward the former intentional design.
Really? So not just passive bureaucratic cloning?
No, they don't present it as passive at all. They present it as a conscious defensive strategy to maintain a unified legal philosophy and to insulate it from the messy, unpredictable nature of democratic elections.
Oh, wow. So protecting the institution from the voters, essentially.
Basically, yeah. The critique is that this hyper-insular environment breeds a very specific, dangerous psychology. The filmmakers actually borrow an English phrase to make their point.
Which phrase?
They claim the institution operates under the delusion that the king can do no wrong.
The king can do no wrong. So it's groupthink on a sovereign level. If you're groomed by the titans who built the system, and your entire professional universe consists of people who revere that system, the capacity for internal dissent vanishes.
It completely evaporates.
You literally lose the basic human ability to recognize your own error.
And that leads to what the documentary terms the holy of holy. The filmmakers argue that this legal elite views their institution as elevated way above the populace.
Like they're untouchable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They draw a sharp contrast in the narrative. Politicians are portrayed through the eyes of the legal establishment, at least as corrupt, agenda-driven creatures swayed by public whims.
Right. And the state attorney.
In contrast, the state attorney is supposedly straight as a ruler, guided only by pure, unadulterated truth.
But the documentary spends the rest of its runtime attempting to aggressively dismantle that exact image of the straight ruler, right?
Absolutely. They tear it apart.
They argue that Nitzan wasn't guided by truth, but by an instinct to preserve and expand his inherited power. And to prove this, they don't start in 2013 when he took office.
No, they go way back.
Yeah, they rewind the clock almost a decade to a very specific historical trauma, the 2005 Gaza disengagement.
Structurally, this is where the documentary establishes its core pattern of behavior. The 2005 disengagement, which was the unilateral withdrawal of Israeli settlements and military from the Gaza Strip, was a massively traumatic and divisive event in Israeli society.
Just incredibly polarized.
Very. It sparked intense civil disobedience, massive protests, and deep societal fracture. And this was largely driven by the political right and the settler movement.
Okay, so hugely volatile time.
And the filmmakers position this chaotic period as Shai Nitzan's true proving ground.
They identify him as the architect of the legal framework that facilitated those evacuations. And they don't just rely on broad statements, do they?
No, they bring data.
Yeah, they deploy some incredibly jarring statistics to paint a picture of coercion. They note that 490 people were indicted during this period.
Which is a staggering number.
It is. And the number that really jumps off the screen is that 172 of those indicted were minors.
Right. And the inclusion of that specific demographic, 172 minors, is a deliberate rhetorical choice by the source.
To show what?
To emphasize the perceived ruthlessness of the legal apparatus. The documentary dives into the mechanic charges to illustrate the severity of the crack.
Yeah, they detail how protesters who were merely standing on the side of the road, not actively engaging in violence or even blocking traffic, were slapped with disproportionately severe charges.
Like sedition and endangering human life.
Let's just look at the legal mechanics of that for a second. Yeah. Charging a bystander with sedition, which is essentially inciting rebellion against the authority of the state, is an astronomical escalation.
It's going nuclear, legally speaking.
Exactly. And the documentary also points out that special tribunals were set up specifically to process these cases, right?
Yes. An initiative they directly credit to Aharon Barak.
Wow. So you have a specialized legal assembly line created solely to process ideological protest. It allowed for rapid judgments and long detention.
The filmmakers are showing us the machinery of state coercion operating at maximum capacity. But the critical analytical question here is hence.
What do you mean?
Well, does the documentary frame Nitzan as a reluctant bureaucrat executing a painful government policy? Or do they imply a darker motivation?
Oh, based on the framing, they absolutely imply he relished the heavy-handedness.
They definitely lean into that.
They don't portray him as a passive administrator. They portray him as a man discovering the full, terrifying weight of the hammer he holds. The video uses commentary suggesting Nitzan applied an excessively harsh hand, specifically to crush a popular rebellion.
Right, crush it completely.
And they point out that even in hindsight, with years of distance, the enforcement during the disengagement is widely viewed as draconian.
And the reason the filmmakers anchor their narrative here is to establish a foundational bias. They are building a sociological profile.
Okay, so it's all leading up to something.
Exactly. By focusing on 2005, they attempt to prove that Nitzan developed a specialized hostility and a willingness to stretch legal norms to their breaking point.
When dealing with a specific demographic.
Yes, specifically the political right.
It's the perfect setup for their next argument.
Yeah.
Because if you can convince the audience that legal authority is willing to throw the book at one specific group of citizens, the natural, unavoidable question is how that authority treats everyone else.
Naturally.
Right. Like, if the scales of justice are heavily weighted on one side, what happens when someone from the other side steps on? This leads the documentary directly into the minefield of selective enforcement.
The transition from the sweeping historical trauma of 2005 to a highly specific, localized courtroom drama in 2014 is very effective.
It's a smart narrative pivot.
It is. The filmmakers zoom in on the Kfar Saba Magistrate Court and a ruling by Judge Nava Bechor. Now, this takes place shortly after Nitzan officially assumes the role of state.
So, placing the responsibility squarely on his shoulder. The case involves a man named Yuri Baram. In September 2014, Baram is facing a full criminal indictment, and his crime. He published a video online that contained incitement against Shai Nitzan.
Right.
Now, just to be fair to the baseline reality of law enforcement here. Threatening a senior public official or inciting violence against them is a serious criminal offense in any jurisdiction.
Oh, undoubtedly. You can't just threaten officials. But the issue the documentary highlights isn't necessarily that Bahram was invested.
What was it then?
It's rather the glaring disparity in how different types of incitement were handled by Nitzan's office. Judge Nava Bechor, in her ruling, actually pulled back the curtain on disparity.
What did she find?
She pointed to documented evidence showing that while Bahram faced the full weight of a criminal indictment for his video against the state attorney, other groups were treated with
Give me an example.
Specifically, left-wing or Arab protesters caught on camera actively chanting "Death to Jews," which is the most literal, direct form of incitement to violence possible, were merely receiving warning letters from the state attorney.
A warning letter? Are you kidding? That is the bureaucratic equivalent of a tap on the wrist.
Just a polite memo, essentially.
Think about the contrast the filmmakers are drawing here. A video criticizing the head of the legal system triggers a severe criminal indictment, but a mob chanting for ethnic violence gets a polite letter asking them to please stop.
It's staggering when you lay it out like that.
It goes way beyond my earlier thought about a referee only calling fouls on one team. This is more like a school principal who expels a student for rolling their eyes, but hands a detention slip to a student who sets fire to the cafeteria.
That's a perfect analogy.
The documentary is alleging a catastrophic failure of protection.
And the filmmakers introduce a really powerful legal concept here. They draw a parallel to the U.S. legal doctrine of outrageous conduct by the prosecution.
Outrageous conduct.
Yeah. They argue that selective enforcement of this magnitude isn't just a glitch in the system. It is a feature that destroys the system entirely.
How so?
When the application of the law becomes subjective, when your likelihood of prosecution depends entirely on your political affiliation or whether your target is the state attorney himself, the justice system ceases to be a tool for public order.
It becomes a weapon.
Exactly, a weapon for political management.
The documentary uses a very specific, deeply resonant Hebrew phrase to describe the gravity of this, Dinei nefesh.
Yes, Dinei nefeshat. It translates essentially to matters of life and death, or matters
involving the soul. That's heavy.
Very. In Jewish legal tradition, it refers to cases where capital punishment or severe physical consequences are at stake. These cases demand the absolute highest level of scrutiny, fairness, and caution.
So by using that term.
By applying this term to the state attorney's selective enforcement, the filmmakers are elevating the critique from a procedural complaint to a profound moral indictment.
They're reminding the audience that a prosecutor's pen can destroy a reputation. It can drain a family's finances and strip a citizen of their liberty.
Yes. And when that immense, life-altering power is wielded based on personal bias, it is a corruption of the soul of...
Now, I did notice a small caveat in the documentary's time problem.
Oh, what's that?
The film acknowledges that Judge Bechor's ruling, the one calling out this selective enforcement, was actually overturned later on appeal by a higher district court.
Yeah.
Doesn't that puncture a hole in their narrative?
From a strictly legal standpoint, perhaps. But from a narrative and sociological standpoint, the filmmakers argue it doesn't matter at all.
Why wouldn't it matter?
Because they claim that regardless of the higher court's technical, procedural reversal, the damage was permanent. The public had already seen the man behind the curtain.
The bell couldn't be unrung.
Exactly. The feeling of unequal justice, the visceral evidence of the disparity between the indictment and the warning letters, it was permanently etched into the public consciousness.
The illusion of the blind scales were shattered.
And no appellate ruling could put it back together.
So the documentary has meticulously built this profile. A legal monarch who inherits a flawless self-image, cuts his teeth by dropping the hammer on political opponents in 2005, and then weaponizes his office to selectively protect his own ego while ignoring violent incitement from others.
It's quite the buildup.
It is. But to truly prove that an institution has become a corrupt kingdom, you have to show more than just biased policy.
Right.
You have to show that the institution is willing to protect its own internal criminality.
Which brings us right back to that staggering hook we opened with the Ruth David scandal.
A bribe.
Yeah. The documentary uses this case as the undeniable smoking gun evidence of institutional rot.
I am honestly still trying to wrap my head around the mechanics of this event as the source presents it. Ruth David was not some low-level clerk. She was the former Tel Aviv district attorney.
She was a titan in that world.
She was part of the absolute inner circle of this legal elite, and she is implicated, alongside a prominent lawyer named Ronald Fisher, and taking a $150,000 bribe.
But as you look closer at the source material, the money is almost the least shocking part of the crime.
Right. The nature of the corruption is what makes it so devastating to the institution's credibility.
Exact. The filmmakers detail that this bribe was paid in exchange for leaking highly classified, covert investigative information directly to crimes.
It's like something out of a movie.
We are talking about a former district attorney acting as a mole for organized crime, tipping off suspects before police raids could occur, effectively neutralizing the state's ability to fight major criminal networks.
It is the ultimate betrayal of the office. So logically, if you are Shai Nitzan and you discover that a former top lieutenant was working for the mob, your immediate reaction should be institutional panic.
Panic and action.
You would assume the state attorney would demand to know who else she compromised, what other cases were tainted, and how long this had been going on.
Because that is how a healthy, transparent institution reacts to an infection. It amputates the diseased limb to save the body.
But that didn't happen here.
No. The documentary presents an interview with Duby Scherzer, the actual investigator who is handling this explosive corruption case. And his account paints a picture of an institution choosing to protect the disease rather than...
Scherzer's memory of this event is incredibly vivid in the film. He describes being in his office on a Friday morning, doing the gritty, necessary work of preparing wiretap requests to blow this corruption ring wide open.
Just doing his job.
Right. And his phone rings, and he sees it's Shai Nitzan calling. And Scherzer admits he had a moment of pride. He thought the boss was calling to commend him for breaking the biggest case of the decade.
Instead, the filmmakers present Scherzer's account of a completely unhinged reaction.
He didn't say good job.
According to Scherzer, Nitzan didn't congratulate. Nitzan began screaming at him uncontrollably over the phone. And the fury wasn't directed at the fact that a former DA was leaking to the mob. The fury was directed at the investigator for having the audacity to pursue Ruth David in the first...
Wait. Let's dissect the psychology of that moment. How does a state attorney justify yelling at an investigator for doing his job on the record? You can't just say, "Stop investigating my friend," out loud without implicating yourself in obstruction of justice.
Right. And the documentary uses this precise question to introduce this sociological concept of institutional self-preservation.
How did that work?
High-status groups, particularly those that view themselves as the moral arbiters of society, often perceive an exposure of their own corruption as a far greater existential threat than the corruption itself.
Okay, that's wild. So it's about image.
Exact. To admit that Ruth David was a criminal mole is to admit that the vetting process is flawed, that the holy of holies has been breached, and most importantly, it provides ammunition to their political critics.
So they protect the brand.
Yeah. The system convinces itself that protecting its reputation is synonymous with protecting the rule of law. Therefore, the investigator exposing the truth becomes the enemy of...
While the corrupt insider is viewed as just an embarrassing family secret that must be managed quiet.
Precise.
And the source claims it went so far that Nitzan literally forced this investigator to apologize to Ruth David. That is a breathtaking humiliation of a public servant trying to stop organized crime.
The filmmakers deploy a brilliant, visceral metaphor here. They describe an institution operating this way as an unventilated room.
Unventilated room.
Yeah. If you keep the doors locked and the windows sealed tight for years on end, eventually the air goes taut, the room is gone.
Makes sense.
The rational response, throw open the windows, launch a massive, transparent internal review. But the documentary argues the system chose to attack the person who pointed out, sealing the windows even tighter.
It is the absolute peak of defensive arrogance, and it perfectly contextualizes the next major battle the documentary explores. Because if a system is willing to scream at its own investigators to protect a mob informant, the absolute last thing it will ever tolerate is a mandated external auditor peering into its files.
Exactly. This leads the filmmakers into the saga of Judge Hila Gerstel, which serves as a masterclass in how bureaucracies can neutralize external threats without ever technically breaking the law.
Whoish.
For context, as public unease regarding the prosecutor's power grew, an attempt was made to introduce checks and balances. The government appointed Hila Gerstel, a highly respected veteran judge, to act as a commissioner for prosecutorial.
So she was given a mandate to look under the hood.
Yes, to audit decisions and handle complaints against the state attorney's office.
And she wasn't some radical anti-establishment firebrand. She was a deeply credentialed member of the legal fraternity. But the documentary claims that the minute she showed up with her flashlight, the system declared total war on her.
Total war.
The filmmakers detail how Nitzan and the powerful prosecutors union launched an absolute crusade to destroy her mandate.
The documentary highlights a fundamental clash of realities here. Gerstel entered the role assuming she was dealing with a standard government agency that would welcome or at least tolerate constructive critique aimed at improving public service.
Which is a normal assumption for an auditor.
Right. When she issued reports criticizing Nitzan's conduct or procedural failures, she expected the standard bureaucratic response, a pledge to review the findings and course correct.
But the filmmakers argue she completely misread the room. She thought she was auditing a government department. But according to the source, she was actually trying to audit a kingdom. And a kingdom does not allow the peasants or even the minor nobility to question the crown.
Exact. The filmmakers posit that Nitzan's violent rejection of her oversight was driven by profound, terror. The system knew that a truly independent, empowered auditor with subpoena power could expose the unventilated room. The documentary claims the prosecutors simply refused to cooperate.
Just flat out refused.
Yeah, they stonewalled her requests, rallied the union to protest her authority, and created an environment of such immense hostility that oversight became structurally impossible.
It reminds me of a corporate scenario where the board demands an audit, but the CEO just locks the financial records in a vault, unplugs the auditor's computer, and tells all the employees to pretend the auditor doesn't exist.
That's a very accurate comparison.
Eventually, the auditor just leaves. And that is precisely what the documentary says happened here. In April 2016, Judge Gerstle resigned. The source quotes her as coming to the devastating realization that the system was rotten from within and that the prosecutors had simply broken the rules of the game.
And the filmmakers are careful to close the loop on this narrative thread. They do acknowledge that following her resignation, the prosecutors' union did eventually agree to a new oversight body.
Oh, they did?
But the documentary dismisses this replacement as a classic bureaucratic farce.
Right. They engage in regulatory capture.
Precise. The filmmakers claim the union only agreed to the new body after ensuring its foundational charter was completely stripped of.
So it was useless by design.
The documentary describes the new commission as having a glorified suggestion box where critical reports could be indefinitely delayed, ignored, or simply shredded without any consequence.
Wow.
The rejection of Gerstle wasn't just a personnel dispute. The filmmakers frame it as the institution officially declaring itself immune to democratic.
So we have a system that the documentary claims is heavy-handed, politically biased, protective of criminal insiders, and immune to oversight. That is a damning indictment on its own.
It really is.
But the source text then pivots to a case that is so chilling, it shifts the critique from bureaucratic corruption to something bordering on malice.
The Zadorovs.
Right. They argue this culture wasn't just about protecting its own power. It was willing to actively manipulate science and destroy an innocent man's life to maintain its illusion of infallibility.
The documentary brings us to the Roman Zadorov case, which is undeniably one of the most famous, traumatic, and heavily scrutinized criminal proceedings.
Okay, lay out the basics for us.
To understand the gravity of the filmmakers' claims here, we have to provide the foundational context that the documentary itself highlights. Roman Zadorov was a man tried and convicted for the horrific murder of a 13-year-old girl.
A truly awful crime.
Horrific. He spent years in prison. However, he was ultimately entirely acquitted, and the state was forced to pay him a staggering 15 million shekels in compensation for wrongful imprisonment.
15 million shekels is not just a settlement. It is a blaring siren of state failure. It is the system admitting a catastrophic error. But the documentary isn't just focusing on the fact that a mistake was made, are they?
No, they're looking at the process.
Right. They are focusing on how Shai Nitzan's office allegedly behaved during the trial to force that mistake to happen in the first place.
The filmmakers zoom in on a pivotal clash over forensic evidence. During the trial, the defense called Dr. Maya Foreman-Resnick a highly respected forensic expert.
Okay.
She provided professional testimony that directly scientifically contradicted the prosecution's narrative of how the murder occurred. Furthermore, her superior, Dr. Chen Kugel, the head of the National Forensic Institute, submitted a sworn affidavit supporting her methodology and defending her professional integrity.
Which is exactly how an adversarial justice system is supposed to function. Experts analyze the evidence, they present their findings, and the court decides.
Right, that's the ideal.
But the documentary claims the prosecution couldn't handle the contradiction. They allege the prosecution attempted to actively tamper with the evidence, pressuring Dr. Kugel to alter his signed affidavit so he wouldn't be able to back up Dr. Foreman-Resnick in open court.
The allegation of witness tampering by the state is profound, but the filmmakers use this as merely the preamble to Nitzan's personal alleged intervention.
Wait, it gets worse.
Oh, yes. The documentary details that later on, Dr. Foreman-Resnick was nominated for a senior, highly specialized appointment within the Ministry of Health.
A completely separate government ministry.
Yes, completely separate. And according to the source, Shai Nitzan illegally reached outside his jurisdiction, contacted the Ministry of Health, and demanded they block her appointment.
You're kidding.
The filmmakers frame this not as a legal dispute, but as pure, unadulterated vindictiveness. They claim Nitzan was attempting to destroy the career of a scientist simply because her honest testimony threatened a high-profile conviction his office death.
I have to pause here because the psychology the documentary is presenting is incredibly dark.
It's very dark.
Let's look at the sunk cost fallacy in criminal justice. Is the documentary implying that Nitzan was just petty? Or are they implying that the system is so absolutely terrified of admitting a mistake that they would literally prefer to see an innocent man rot in a cell rather than admit a forensic error?
The filmmakers explicitly point to the latter. They argue this is the terrifying, inevitable endpoint of the king can do no wrong pathology.
So they can never be wrong.
Exactly. If the foundation of your institutional power relies on the public believing you are flawless and straight as a ruler, admitting to a wrongful conviction in a case that gripped the entire nation is an existential threat.
Because if you admit you were wrong about Zadorov, the public instantly asks, what else are you wrong about? Who else is in prison who shouldn't be?
Exactly. The documentary utilizes another profound Hebrew concept here, cheshbon nefesh.
Cheshbon nefesh.
Yeah. It translates to soul-searching or deep, honest self-reflection. It's often associated with acknowledging one's sins and committing to change.
Okay, I see where this is going.
The filmmakers declare that the state attorney's office under Nitzan was structurally and psychologically incapable of engaging in cheshbon nefesh.
Incapable of it.
Right. Instead of pausing the trial and saying, our forensic evidence is flawed, we need to find the real killer, the documentary claims the system opted to threaten the scientists, suppress the truth, and prioritize the institution's win record over a citizen's life.
It paints a picture of a system that is fundamentally offensive, not defensive. If you get in their way, even by just doing your job honest, they will find a way to break you.
That's the argument, yes.
And if they can destroy a forensic scientist's career over a courtroom dispute, what happens when they decide they want to dictate who actually gets to run the country's law enforcement?
That perfectly transitions the documentary right into the political arena, specifically focusing on the tactic of torpedoing executive appointments.
Oh, right.
The filmmakers introduced the case of Gal Hirsch to illustrate how bureaucratic power can override democratic elections.
Let's dissect the mechanics of this because it is fascinating. Gal Hirsch was a highly decorated, well-known military commander.
Yeah.
The elected government nominated him to become the National Police Commissioner. He was an outsider, right?
Yeah.
Someone not bred within the legal and law enforcement establishment.
A true outsider, yeah.
And according to the documentary, the milieu, this entrenched kingdom we've been discussing, absolutely despised the idea of an outsider taking control of the police force.
So the analytical question the filmmakers pose is, how does an unelected bureaucracy legally stop a democratic government from appointing the candidate?
Because you can't just veto the prime minister without cause.
Exactly. The documentary claims the answer is the weaponization of dormant paper.
Dormant paperwork.
Yeah, the filmmakers allege that the moment Hirsch's nomination was announced, the system initiated the equivalent of a bureaucratic denial of service attack on his career.
Wow. What does that look like?
Suddenly, incredibly old, dusty, entirely stale investigations from years past issues that no one had looked at or cared about for a decade were miraculously pulled from the bottom of file.
The documentary states that Shai Nitzan actively approved these stalling tactics.
Mm-hmm.
And the genius of this maneuver, as the filmmakers explain it, is that you don't need a conviction.
Yeah.
You don't even need an indictment. You just need an open file. Once an investigation is technically active, the legal advisors step in and inform the government, it is legally unreasonable to appoint a police commissioner while he is under active investigation. You must wait until we clear his name.
Which takes years. It is an inescapable trap. The government can't appoint him. The target can't clear his name because the investigation is purposefully moving at a snail's pace.
Right.
And eventually, the government is forced to withdraw the nomination just to fill the position. The filmmakers call this a systematic method of targeted assassination of...
The documentary presents this not as an isolated incident, but as a known standard operating procedure. They claim that if you are nominated for a senior role and the system views you as a threat, a sudden investigation or a coordinated leaked media crusade against you is a mathematical certainty.
The contrast the filmmakers create between this and the Ruth David scandal is stunning.
Oh, it really is.
In Ruth David's case, you have a verified, blatant criminal taking mafia bribe, and the system bends space and time to protect her and yell at the investigator.
But with Gal Hirsch.
In Gal Hirsch's case, you have a decorated military outsider, and the system fabricates a crisis out of thin air to ensure his destruction.
The documentary is illustrating a terrifying symmetry here. The system's power is absolute, in both its ability to shield its friends and annihilate its enemies.
And the filmmakers use this symmetry to set the stage for the climax of the documentary. They have built the case that's politically biased, protects criminals, rejects oversight, manipulates evidence, and vetoes democratic.
So where does it all lead?
They argue that all of these dysfunctions eventually merged, converging into one massive, catastrophic campaign that defined Nixon's legacy.
They are talking about the flagship case, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
The immense, multi-pronged investigations into Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
The filmmakers present the Netanyahu investigations as the ultimate obsession, the defining crusade of Shai Nitzan's tenure.
Okay.
The documentary's thesis here is that in pursuit of this one singular target, absolutely every other ethical, legal, and procedural boundary within the justum was obliterated.
So the pursuit of the whale justified burning down the entire rulebook.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, the documentary provides an anecdote that sounds like it was ripped from a paranoid espionage thriller.
Oh, I remember this part.
They feature an interview detailing a moment when a senior police investigator, a major figure deeply involved in the Netanyahu probe, approached the process.
But he wasn't bringing a new piece of evidence against the prime minister.
No, he was attempting to blow the whistle on staggering illegal actions occurring within his own investigation.
The documentary details how this senior investigator realized his colleagues were actively crossing legal lines to build the case. Understanding the danger of exposing high-ranking officials within the most high-profile case in the country's history, he made two very calculated, reasonable requests before handing over the intelligence.
Right. What were...
First, he asked for a baseline level of immunity from retaliation. Second, to prove he wasn't fabricating a conspiracy, he offered to take a polygraph test immediately, putting his pension, his freedom, and his entire career on the line to prove his claims were factual.
He is literally begging them to test his honesty. He is saying, strap me to the machine. I will prove to you that our team is breaking the law.
And how does the documentary say the prosecution responded? They specifically named prosecutor Aharon Barak.
According to the filmmakers, prosecutor Barak flatly refused the polygraph offer. She rejected the immunity request.
So what did she want?
Instead, she demanded that the investigator write a formal, detailed letter outlining the allegation and sign his name to it before they would even consider looking at the evidence.
Which is the bureaucratic equivalent of telling a whistleblower to go stand blindfolded in the middle of a highway.
The documentary argues she knew exactly what she was.
Of course.
She knew that no senior officer understanding the vindictive nature of the system as established in the Ruth David and Gal Hirsch case would ever formally sign his name to a document burning his own department without prior legal.
So by demanding the formal letter, the filmmakers argue she engineered a situation where the whistleblower was forced to back down, ensuring the internal criminality remained permanently buried.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the ends justifying the means. It is a prosecutor realizing that the people building the case are breaking the law, but deciding to look the other way because the target is too important.
The documentary is essentially asking, if you have to commit crimes to catch a criminal, are you a justice system or just a rival gang?
The filmmakers solidify this point by highlighting a later development. Another officer, Sachi Chufkin, eventually did take the stand in open court and testified under oath about severe, flawed, and illegal actions taken during the investigation.
And surely, once it was exposed in open court under oath, the system finally engaged in that cheshbon nefesh. Surely had...
According to the documentary, absolutely nothing happened.
Nothing.
The filmmakers claim that even after the rot was exposed in front of a judge, the system rallied entirely to protect the corrupt investor. No one was fired, no apology.
Unbelievable.
The documentary concludes that the flagship case proved the institution had lost all moral. They argue that in their obsession with capturing the prime minister, they became the very corruption they...
Which brings us to the final act of this incredibly dense narrative. Shai Nitzan's tenure eventually ended. But the documentary argues that the kingdom he built did not fall with his departure. Let's look at how the filmmakers analyze his succession and his ultimate legacy.
The documentary spends its closing minutes analyzing the mechanics of how power is transferred in a closed loop.
Right.
They note that back in 2015, while still at the height of his power, Nitzan pushed to appoint a man named Amit Eisman to a senior regional role, despite the filmmakers claiming there were active, documented complaints regarding Eisman's internal...
Okay, so a controversial pick.
Yeah. Fast forward to 2021, and Amit Eisman ascends to the ultimate role. He becomes the new state attorney.
The crown is successfully passed down the bloodline.
The filmmakers make a highly aggressive, specific allegation here regarding the motive for this succession. They claim Nitzan championed Eisman specifically because he required someone who toe the line.
Toe the line regarding the Netanyahu cases, right?
Precise. The documentary argues that Nitzan's greatest terror was a strong, independent, external candidate taking over the office.
Because they might rock the boat.
More than that, an outsider might open the files, review the chaotic, allegedly tainted evidence compiled against the prime minister, and decide to withdraw the indictments entirely.
To protect the legacy.
To prevent his legacy from being disbanded, the filmmakers argue Nitzan ensured his successor was a loyalist who would protect the flagship case and maintain the kingdom's impenetrable wall.
It is a profoundly bleak assessment of institutional capital, and the documentary does not pull any punches regarding the fallout. They state unequivocally that as a direct result of these years of arrogance, selective enforcement, and cover-up, public trust in the Israeli justice system is currently at absolute rock bottom.
However, they do employ a very classic, important rhetorical caveat to end their argument.
What's that?
The narrator explicitly states that 99.9% of regular, everyday prosecutors working in the system are honest, dedicated, hardworking public.
Well, that's good. They make that distinction.
Yeah, the filmmakers acknowledge that these line-level attorneys are the ones unjustly bearing the brunt of the public's furious backlash. They state clearly, the people are not the problem.
They use a very direct quote aimed squarely at the top. You are the head, you are to blame. It is the eternal truth that a fish rots from the head down. The thousands of honest prosecutors are trapped in an unventilated room built by their leadership.
The documentary delivers its final verdict on Shai Nitzan's legacy with brutal efficiency. They summarize his entire tenure in 3 devastating lies, corruption, and selective enforcement.
Wow.
The filmmakers claim he left behind a judicial apparatus that is entirely disconnected from truth, accountability, and the public it was created to serve.
So after laying out this exhaustive, terrifying indictment, does the documentary offer a way out? If the system is a closed loop, if it destroys whistleblowers, neuters oversight, and handpicks its own successors, how do the filmmakers suggest society actually fix it?
They offer a 2-pronged conclusion, one structural and one societal. Structurally, the filmmakers suggest that the only mathematical way to check this kind of entrenched power is to implement aggressive external mechanisms. For example, they propose appointing entirely external judges, people with absolutely no ties to the prosecution, determine conflicts of interest, permanently removing the insensibility itself.
But based on the story they just told about Judge Gerstle, they must know the system will just fight those external judges to the death.
Exactly. Which is why the documentary ends with a much more volatile, stark warning.
Let's hear it.
The filmmakers argue that a rotting system facing massive, building public demand for change cannot survive indefinitely in a vacuum. They suggest that true, lasting reform will never come from polite committee meetings or internal.
So what's left?
The implication is that the institution is too far gone to reform itself. It must be forced to collapse under the weight of massive, disruptive public protest, and only then can it be rebuilt from the outside.
Okay. We have covered an immense, heavy landscape of information today. Let's take a breath and synthesize what we've explored.
Sounds good.
We have spent this deep dive deconstructing a highly specific, intensely critical piece of media. This documentary painted the Israeli State Attorney's Office not as a pillar of democratic justice, but as a runaway train of institutional hubris.
Absolutely.
We analyzed their claims regarding the origins of this mindset, the ideological targeting during the 2005 disengagement, the hypocrisy of selective enforcement, the aggressive protection of corrupt insiders like Ruth David,
The destruction of Judge Gerstle's oversight.
right, and the terrifying manipulation of science in the Zadorov case, the weaponization of bureaucracy against Gal Hirsch, and finally, the willingness to break the law to build the flagship case against the prime minister.
If we step back and look at the architecture of the filmmaker's argument, regardless of where any listener stands on the spectrum of Israeli politics, the source is using the figure of Shai Nitzan to tell a profoundly universal cautionary tale.
Universal indeed.
It is a story exploring what happens when the watchers ensure that absolutely no one is. It is an exploration of the fatal moment when an institution conflates its own reputation and preservation with the preservation.
It is a reminder that institutions are not machine, They are made of people, and people are susceptible to the most dangerous drug on earth, unchecked power. The documentary is demanding that we stop blindly trusting the label on the building and start heavily scrutinizing the people holding the keys.
It leaves us with a profound tension regarding the nature of reform and accountability in any democracy.
Which leads me to a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your day. Something building on the psychology this text presented, but taking it one step further. The documentary argues that massive public protests are the only way to force this closed system to change. But think about the specific pathology the filmmakers just described. If an institution genuinely believes it is the sole, flawless protector of justice, if it truly operates under the delusion that the king can do no wrong, and views the public as an irrational mob, will external protests ever actually inspire internal soul searching?
Or will it backfire?
Right. Will screaming at the gates simply convince the king that he was right all along, causing the institution to build its fortress walls even higher? Something to think about the next time you read the news. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives around you, and we'll see you next time.